Good morning. I'm Assembly Member Navin Shah, Chair of London Assembly's Transport Committee. I'm pleased to welcome to City Hall and to our London Assembly's Transport Committee meeting those in the public gallery and the audience viewing the webcast. You can take part in our discussions on social media using the hashtag London Assembly and hashtag Assembly Transport. Our substantive topic for today's Transport Committee meeting is a discussion with Commissioner of Transport for London, Mike Brown. Welcome, Mike. This is your last appearance before this committee, so please enjoy and share your experience with us. Thank you very much. But before we start our discussion, I must deal with some of procedural items on the agenda, so please bear with us. May I first ask everyone to check that their electronic devices are switched off or are left on silence mode to avoid any interruptions to the meeting. Do we have apologies for absence?
Chair, we've received apologies for absence from Assembly Member Eshlomi and Assembly Member Bacon. Assembly Member Arba is attending as a substitute.
Welcome, Assembly Member Arba, and thank you for subbing this morning. Any declarations of interest other than noted on pages 1 to 4? Are there any other declarations? And can we note the list of declarations in the report for the committee? Thank you very much. Minutes of the meeting. Can we agree the minutes from our meetings on 17th December 2019 and the one on 8th of January this year?
Agreed.
Thank you. Summary list of actions. Can we note the summary list of actions as they appear on the report?
Voted.
Thank you very much. Right. Now we come to the main topic of the agenda, our discussion with the Transport Commissioner, Mike Brown, MVO. Can I invite the Commissioner, if you'd like to make an opening statement?
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to the committee for having me this morning, and thanks for allowing me to make a few opening remarks. As you say, what will be my last appearance in front of this committee, although I am back with the Mayor in front of the overall Assembly before the mayoral election. If I may, I'd like to start by thanking the thousands of women and men who come to work every day to keep London moving and make the city better, safer and cleaner for everybody, whether that's our tube and bus drivers, those who work on stations, those who work through the night to maintain or improve our network, or our partners in our supply chain. They really are, to some extent, the unsung heroes of London, and their dedication is second to none, and it is indeed my absolute privilege to work alongside some really fantastic people. I've been coming to this committee for the 5 years now as Commissioner, and these years have proven to be full of significant improvements and full of significant challenges. Throughout my time as Commissioner, we've worked to grow and improve the transport offered in London to support jobs, homes and a thriving economy, to connect communities, attract business to the city and to safeguard the environment. Just since I was here last year, we've boosted further the capacity, for example, on the Victoria Line, awarded the contract to design and manufacture new DLR trains, and started operating TfL rail services between Paddington and Reading. We've introduced 7 new bus services, meeting the demands of our growing city, introducing a range of new safety features as part of our work to eradicate deaths and serious injuries from London's roads. We've continued with our work to clean up the bus fleet, and indeed by the end of this year, all buses will be Euro 6 or better, and we now have the UK's first bus routes to use only electric double-deckers, and this year we also placed an order for the world's first hydrogen double-deck bus. We've introduced new trains and increased services on the London Overground line between Gospel Oak and Barking after a very frustrating delay, and have introduced more frequent services now on the North London line too, and for the first time run London Overground services on Boxing Day. We've started issuing safety permits as part of our world-leading direct vision standard scheme, which will take the most dangerous lorries off our roads, and we're about to mark the first anniversary of the introduction of the ultra-low emission zone, which has reduced the harmful levels of NOx by over 30%. Over the last 4 years, we have more than doubled the amount of protected cycle space on our roads and worked tirelessly to improve safety with a huge range of junction improvement work across the city. Obviously, still more to do. Progress continues also with the Northern Line extension to Battersea, the tube modernisation programme, which will boost frequency and cut journey times on 40% of the tube network by introducing modern digital signalling in place of a system with some parts commissioned at the start of the century. And of course, the completion of the Elizabeth Line, which has been subject to much scrutiny correctly by this committee, given its very, very disappointing delay. It will, of course, when it opens, revolutionise travel across London. The overall share of journeys made by walking, cycling or public transport is now at 63%, up from about 50% when TfL was first formed 20 years ago. And that's the equivalent share of removing some 2.9 million private hire vehicle trips from London's roads every day. This is a success story of investment in sustainable transport. But Chair, if I may, we are now at a vital crossroads. Indeed, history may come to show just how significant this moment is. We're just very close now, a few weeks away from the government's budget, with a spending review to follow shortly after. For London and the South East, both could have genuinely significant implications. The Prime Minister has spoken frequently of a levelling up that will see more investment channeled to the north and other regions of the UK. I absolutely welcome that commitment and see the need to invest across the UK, and we will continue as TfL to work with authorities across the country to share knowledge, help towns, cities and regions with their transport challenges. But it serves no one if this levelling up is achieved at the expense of London. Businesses and other stakeholders want certainty that levelling up does not mean, in fact, levelling down from a London perspective. Because it's been through steady and sustained funding that the capital's transport network was revived from the state it was in before TfL was formed some 20 years ago and turned into a viable system to support the growth and success of London, including, of course, the success on the world stage, especially the fantastic performance during the Olympic and Paralympic Games. We cannot let that investment go to waste and roll back to a time where the transport network was a real drag on the economy and the economic success of our city. TfL now receives 40% less overall funding than it did in 2010-11. And in March 2018, we became one of the only transport authorities in the world not to receive direct government operating grant for day-to-day running costs. This means a recurring loss of around £700 million per year from what we used to receive. Working with the Mayor, of course, we've done our part. We have absorbed the additional capital costs, foregone revenue resulting from the delay to Crossrail, and we've made huge reductions in costs, improved efficiency and suspended non-essential work. But, Chair, if we're going to have a safe, reliable transport network capable of meeting demand and supporting a functioning and growing city, we need government investment, and we need certainty of that investment now. So I want to continue to work with the government to achieve that long-term funding certainty, to support the vital work of maintaining and intensifying the use of TfL's core assets and expanding the network to improve connectivity, cut carbon, attract business and support new homes. With government support, but only with government support, we can complete the upgrade of the tube network. We can replace the ancient signalling on the Piccadilly line and unlock an extra 60% capacity on that line alone. We can replace the Bakerloo line trains, which are now, Chair, the oldest anywhere in the country. With government support, we can accelerate the electrification and decarbonisation of the bus network, not just here, but given that half of all the UK buses are actually in London, we can help facilitate that across the country overall too. With government support, we can move forward with highly important extensions of the network that would support thousands of new homes, for example, extending the Bakerloo line, extending the DLR to Thamesmead, and improving suburban rail services, and of course progressing Crossrail too as well. But we need your help. Chair, the support as always of this committee and of the London Assembly more widely is vital in helping us to secure what London needs for the future. Now, this committee has quite rightly held me to account over the last 4 or 5 years, often in a forceful and very challenging way. It's not always been in a way that I've 100% agreed with, it's fair to say, but I've never doubted the professional integrity of all of you on this committee and your support for London. I've aspired to raise those levels of integrity as well. And that integrity and professionalism from you working with us is now needed more than ever for us to jointly support a clear and optimistic offer to London to ensure we can continue to deliver for this city, for the wider South East and for the UK as a whole. I hope we can continue to work together to achieve this collectively. And now, Chair, of course, as ever, I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner, for your assessment of how the committee has interacted with you, which is our role, our responsibility, and I'm pleased that it's been a positive experience overall. And indeed, you have been a true ambassador of transport overall, provided from your decades of service, commitment, and experience, the leadership that the transport required for London. You have already reflected on some major improvements and achievements that have been made over your sort of involvement through successive sort of mayors, etc., which is only right. Would you like to give us your reflections from your sort of legacy, pretty much, where we have failed or where things could be done better for the future?
Well, thank you, Chair. Yes, by all means. I think if I could just say up front, the most dreadful time of my 30 years since I started working for London Transport or Transport for London was, of course, the tragic train crash at Sandylands, the overturning of the tram at Sandylands. And actually every other disappointment, and there have been many, which I'll touch on, are overshadowed by that particular incident, which I very much regret. I am pleased, and by the way, I should just say that those who lost their lives and all those affected, their families and all victims of that incident are in my mind absolutely every day. I will never forget that day, and it was a terrible thing for everyone affected, of course. I would say, I think, overall, that while we have seen the benefit of sustained levels of investment in transport over the last 20 years since the creation of TfL and since the creation, Chair, of this Assembly and of the position of Mayor in the modern age in London, I think we have achieved a lot, but we are, as I say, at that cusp now, so really important that we don't lose that momentum. I came to London, first of all, in the early 1980s, and London was a city in decline. The tube network was closing crossovers and junctions because there wasn't any money to maintain them. I remember the days, because I lived on the Northern Line, where 30% of trains were cancelled in the morning peak. Numbers that are unimaginable for the modern era, but that was the reality. And I'm sure members will have looked with interest at some of the commentary recently about the performance of other subways around the world. New York gets mentioned a lot, where there hasn't been that sustained level of capital investment or indeed of maintenance focus, because there hasn't been the money to do it. And that's the kind of reality you can end up with very quickly. So we have to continue to have that successful investment. In terms of capital delivery, my real big regret, of course, of recent times is the Crossrail delay. Massive lessons for going forward in that regard. Lessons of how you appropriately ensure a board holds an executive properly to account, so that there isn't a culture created, albeit unwittingly, I would suggest, but a culture nonetheless that doesn't allow the flushing up of the reality of the situation at sub-programme level, at working level, to be highlighted to board level and beyond. I think that's a massive regret. And the prospect, therefore, of, I think, properly refreshing leadership and management throughout the project life cycle of these major schemes is a really important issue. It's a very different skill set required when you're commissioning a project, you're letting the contracts, you're setting out to on the starting point for a series of sub-projects to be delivered, than it is to do the commissioning, as we're discovering at the moment, where you need a different skill set to actually bring a project, a construction project, into a fully operating railway. So, look, many things to celebrate and sort of be thankful for in our city. And, I always reflect when I go to other cities that, we're not perfect, but we have much to teach other cities. But we must always be sufficiently humble and have the humility to learn from great examples elsewhere as well. And I do see great examples where other cities have still done some really good things that we need to continue to aspire to do. Clearly, the other thing that's changed in recent years, is recently, really in the last 4 years, I think, is that the whole issue of climate change, of air quality, of decarbonisation has become, in many ways, a very non-controversial issue in this country and throughout this Assembly, whatever party members sit within. And I think that's a real sense of, for my successor to continue to drive that momentum. It's a really important thing for our children and grandchildren, and something we just have to up our game on, I think, as a city, as a country, as a world.
Yeah. Commissioner, before I move on to questions related to performance and Mayor's transport strategy, one question, I'll read it as it is and put it then in layman's terms, or how I feel about it. How will TfL work to improve its organizational responsiveness to data and information requests from stakeholders? If I have to put it bluntly, I think TfL has still got to go some way before there's confidence within the sort of Londoners in terms of how accountable it is and how well it reflects both effectively and speedily to issues that come about day by day. There's certainly strong criticism still, and what you have to say about that?
Well, I think, Chair, that's fair to some extent. I think we can always do better, and you know, the Budget Performance Committee and other committees of the Assembly have challenged me on this as well as the Transport Committee over the years. I think we do, you know, genuinely, at least I've striven under my leadership to ensure that we are as open and as accountable and as transparent as possible. There is a huge amount of information we, of course, produce for our various committees and panels of our boards, and I do recognise that there's a huge volume of that, and often some of the core bits of information may be sort of buried, not deliberately by the way, but they're buried in a large tranche of other documentation. But I do think, particularly on project delivery, particularly on performance statistics, we have to continue to challenge ourselves even more. I'm really pleased, just on one specific issue, that when I took over this job 4.5 years ago, we had a massive backlog of, for example, freedom of information requests. We're now right on top of those. We've been consistently on top of them for the last 3 years, as we should be, because if people want to hold us to account, and they should do, because we are a public body accountable to you and accountable to London, it's really important that we are seen to be open. So there's always more we can do. As I've said to the Transport Committee and the Budget and Performance Committee previously, I am always happy to take suggestions to see how we can continue to improve. And it is, again, one of the things that I'll be talking to my successor, whoever she or he is, in that context, because to my mind you can never be open enough in terms of sharing data, sharing information, sharing performance statistics, subject of course to the occasional one where there'll be some commercial sensitivity, which I know all of you will understand.
Okay, let's move on to MTS performance related queries we have. For the period 9 scorecard,
Yeah.
and considering the year-to-date figures, which performance targets are you proud of, and where do you think they need much more improvements?
Well, I think the one that the ones that, I mean, I'm proud of a lot of the things that we've been doing, and in particular, actually, I always start with safety, because that's the way I start every meeting internally, and indeed every external meeting I attend in this role. I am pleased that we've made progress on people killed or seriously injured involving buses. I think that is a key step forward. I'm really pleased, Chair, that in that regard the bus industry does now give a sense of really coming with us in this joint journey to tackle safety issues on or by a bus. So the new bus safety standard that we've been applying, the new vehicle that has now been on trial and on display in Route 100 with the video cameras replacing mirrors, much greater visibility in poor lighting conditions when it's dark or when there's just poor weather conditions out there, the anti-slip flooring, the sound for electric vehicles, of course, that is being trialled as well. You know, huge number of features that are being delivered by the bus industry. I was down at Abellio's bus garage in southwest London as well, where you know, again, we're seeing this modal technology that supports and helps the driver in potential for collisions occurring and reducing all of that. So I'm very pleased with that. I think there's still an awful lot more to do for people being killed or seriously injured on London's road network overall. And that's out with any particular issue with a bus or anything else, but particularly those vulnerable, road users of pedestrians, cyclists or motorcyclists. And motorcyclists in particular is an area that we need to do more to work with industry, work more generally across London to tackle. and there's always more we can do. But, you know, I've always held, you know, within my team, this took a while to get to where we need to, but I'm absolutely determined that we take accountability for this. It may be an unreasonable accountability on road safety, Chair, but I just feel that if Transport for London, however unreasonable the accountability might be, we don't take an overarching accountability for road safety in a city, then no one else will. And I'm always reminded that when I look at the numbers and the statistics for people killed or seriously injured on our road network, that every one of those numbers is a human being. And, you know, when I've met relatives and those bereaved, and when I've met victims of serious injury on our road network, it's an incredibly humbling experience. And, you know, it just reinforces my absolute determination that we have to do more in this regard, and we have to do more to tackle this. And society's changing. There are many challenges, you know, people wandering around looking at their mobile phones, drivers not complying, even as we introduce 20 miles an hour speed limit on the Transport for London road network to support some of the great things boroughs have been doing. We need to move faster, I think, in terms of learning from the great practice that individual boroughs have applied, because when I go around in my borough visits, almost every borough I visit is doing something excellent and sometimes a bit too unique that isn't easily shared more collectively across the other 31, 32 boroughs. So I do want to make sure that we really continue to harness the energy and effort going on there and that momentum. So that's an area that I'm disappointed with in terms of performance. The other one is on tube excess journey time, because that has taken a bit of a blip. I mean, the context of that, of course, is that we are scheduling to run an awful lot more kilometres year on year than we've ever done. So even this year, we've increased the number of kilometres. I mentioned in my opening remarks the Victoria line is one example, but we have over recent years extended the peak on both the Northern and Jubilee lines as well. But I think it's fair to say there's been a couple of blips on tube performance in the last few months. One was some initial teething problems we had with the commissioning of the digital signalling system around the Baker Street area, we can just call it that generically, and also the issue which I know you will be aware of, where we found a crack on some Jubilee line trains where we had to really get into some pretty intensive work to rectify that problem. It seems that was a problem that harks back from the original design of those trains way back in the 1990s. But nonetheless, it was very disappointing. The fact that we're now back running a full service on the Jubilee line is good, but I do recognise that was a difficult challenge as well. So I think, you know, those are the headlines of things that I think I'm sort of most focused on at the moment in terms of scorecard performance. Other ones in terms of investment programme milestones are there as well. But again, I'm confident we've got a grip of where we are with those. Some of the variations are very small in the overall scheme of projects, and some of them are actually due to very important commercially beneficial reasons that we've not spent as much money as we might have predicted. Money itself is not, or indeed the interim milestones aren't always the best measure of success there. But nonetheless, we keep a very close eye on it.
Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you. Amongst that lengthy response, Mike, you mentioned motorcycles.
Yeah.
I think I can say thank you. Some of the potholes that we discussed a couple of weeks ago miraculously were filled within a day or two.
It's the power of the Assembly.
Before I could take a photograph of them. Yeah. Anyway, you say you're focusing on motorcycle safety, but I have seen no evidence of TfL making any efforts to improve safety of motorcyclists. Certainly the number of KSIs hasn't improved at all. In fact, I think it's even getting worse. Could you actually tell the committee exactly what you are doing to improve motorcycle safety?
Well, first thing I would say is, of course, there is always more to do, and you quite rightly have held me to account in this regard. I mean, some of these, you know, if you do the breakdown, the subcategory breakdown of motorcycle incidents, there are a huge number of issues still related to the nature of the way that motorcyclists are operated by some people. Now, that's a terrible thing to say when somebody's lost their lives or been injured or killed, but it is a fact. So I think we have to do much more at education to ensure that there is a consistent level of education for people, and also for people who are potentially returning to motorcycling, perhaps in later years of their lives, because there is again a trend, if I look at the breakdown of the numbers, where people who potentially haven't ridden a bike for some time are going back to riding a bike. So how can we ensure there's an education that just reminds people that it's not quite the same road conditions as they might have been accustomed to when they first learnt to ride a motorbike some years ago. I think the other thing that we've got to just keep a close eye on is the way that the economy in London is changing, and we have tried to make some efforts to engage more proactively with the delivery companies. Of course, there's a lot of motorcyclists around, and we all will have witnessed some potentially unsafe behaviours from some delivery drivers, delivery cyclists. It's not to say they're all in that category, and I recognise they've got a very demanding and important role to play, but I think again we've got to do some more education in that regard. So I don't want to say for 1 second we've got this cracked, but we will continue to to explore whatever efforts we can in this aspect. And as ever, your knowledge of this area is welcome, and I would very much support any insights you can give us as to what more we should be focusing on.
You said a lot there, Mike, but actually I don't think I've identified a single thing that you said you're actually doing.
Well, we are doing some education programmes.
But what are you doing?
Well, so we are doing some
exactly. What are you doing to improve the road surfaces? What are you doing to improve the training? You're quite right. You've identified returners. I'm one of those.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of any training schemes that are available to me. And you're absolutely right. The bikes are different to what they used to be when I started. The roads are definitely far more congested. They're much narrower now than they used to be because of the cycle lanes and so on.
Yeah.
But what are you actually doing, Mike? What have you actually done? What recommendations in the Easy Rider have you undertaken to do?
Well, we have done some things. So I'm going to try and find out the detail of it here. The one thing I would say that's very important, which you alluded to there, is that you will recall that we had a pause in some proactive road maintenance for a couple of years because of the budgeting issues, so a kind of issue. And I did commit, by the way, that we would, to you, I've said this to you several times, Chair, through you, but in terms of ensuring that safety issues were addressed in the road network. You've highlighted to me previously, you just mentioned one such instance where potholes had emerged that weren't being fixed, but that is a very important part of ensuring safety for motorcyclists, because I'm very conscious of the particular vulnerabilities you get motorcyclists and indeed cyclists on the road network if there is a perturbation, some sort of safety issue potentially on the road network. We've always sought to address those, but now of course we are back doing that proactive maintenance again in the business plan, which you will have noticed. So that is a very important issue as well. So the other thing that we're doing for motorcyclists, it may be not directly for motorcyclists because it affects all road users, is of course the work on safer junctions, where that of course has benefits for all road users, because it's not just about cyclists and pedestrians, it is about all road users being able to... From
memory, Mike, without being rude, we're seeing an increase in KSI in some of those safety junctions.
Well, some of them we are.
It's not doing anyone any favours, seriously.
Well, some of them we are, and some of them will go back and try again. I mean, I've never said, or any of my colleagues, I don't think have ever said to this committee or anywhere else that we're perfect in all of these things. That would be an incredibly arrogant thing to suggest. We do modelling, we look and we look and see what we can do to make a junction safer. If we don't make it safer, or if we in an unintended way import other risks into a junction as a result of that work, we'll of course go back and revisit it. So we're always going to continue to work on this area. I mean, it's incredibly important to me. If I look at the breakdown of fatalities from last year, and you know the numbers, 71 of the fatalities were pedestrians, but the second highest category was motorcyclists at 32 for London overall. So I'm not complacent in this regard at all.
No, you say that, Mike, but I'm not being funny.
Yeah.
But what are you doing? Because you're not doing anything. Well, you're giving us loads of words, and you're very eloquent, and your voice is lovely to listen to. I have to say that. But at the end of the day, there's no content, mate. You're not saying anything. You're not telling me what you're doing. You're alluding to what you might be doing. You're alluding to what you should be doing. But what are you doing? Well, Give me 3 things that TfL are doing right now to improve motorcycle safety. 3 things. That's all I'm asking. No more words. No more waffle. Three things, please.
Safer junctions, 20 mile an hour speed limits, and ensuring that we're back spending the proactive road maintenance. That's three things.
Well, that's, yeah, but we've said that the safety junctions are actually increasing deaths in some areas, and we've evidence that when it comes to 20 mile per hour speed limits, accidents are increasing in the two cities where they've introduced them.
Not in all cases, Chair. I think that's an incredibly generalisation. Where actually there's been some remarkable improvements in some of the safer junctions. It's disingenuous to say that that's the case generically in the way you're describing it. And Chair, if I may, I won't accept that because it's not true.
Thank you. Let me intervene here. I think we had a response. If you want to pursue this further, please, Assembly Member Prince, do follow that through.
That's fine, Chair. That's fine. I'm happy to stop asking questions about people being killed on our streets, people dying on our streets. If you want to shut me down, that's fine. That's what I expect.
You made your views clear. Let's move on.
Thank you.
After that challenging intervention, can I bring to something which is indeed a good situation? What do you attribute for the improved performance on reducing the numbers of those killed or seriously injured on roads? And importantly, do you think this is sustainable? How would you sustain this safety aspects that we have achieved?
Well, no, of course it's not sustainable. I mean, any increase, as I said, any individual, Chair, it is of huge regret to me that these, that these issues are occurring on the road network. The other thing I could have said if I was going to answer the previous questioner on other issues, of course, the direct vision standard, which makes a material difference for motorcyclists in London road network. That is seen as world leading. Before we left the European Union, it was adopted by the European Commission as a standard to be applied across Europe, so we'll continue to pursue that work. As I've said, we'll continue to pursue the implementation of 20 mile an hour zones on most of the Transport for London road network. That's a significant improvement as well. So, we are continuing to try and eat away at these depressing numbers in the context of, general road behaviour and general way that people behave across the streets of London. I mean, this is not an easy task. And as I've said earlier on, I do take it extraordinarily seriously because not all the roads, only 5% of roads in London are Transport for London roads. But the key is working with the boroughs. The key is those partnerships, for example, with the freight industry. I have another meeting with the freight industry tomorrow evening where I will again be thanking them for the support. Again, just a few years ago, we had a real set of conflict with the freight and delivery industry in London. And I give huge credit to the FTA and the RHA for their work in collaboration with us on the 4 standard, on the direct vision standard, and on other things that were historically seen as really challenging and unachievable. But, the vehicle manufacturers have come on board. We're making massive progress. And anyone, and I'm sure some of you have been in a vehicle with lower set driver cabs with proper direct visibility around them. It is a huge difference in terms of motorcyclists, but also cyclists and pedestrians as well. And really important that we continue with that work.
From the evidence we have and from your knowledge and experience, do you think that Vision Zero and the measures that are sort of part of that approach would help somewhat to sustain the sort of safety that we see on the roads?
Well, yeah, we've got to achieve Vision Zero because any single lost life or serious injury is one too many. And if you asked any individual, whether they're a freight driver, whether they're a car driver, whether they're a taxi or private hire vehicle operator, a bus driver, anyone else, if anyone gets up in the morning seeking to do anything other than operate safely on London's road network, of course they would say no. And that's why things like our recent promotional campaign, which you'll have seen with the kids in the back of a car with a dad driving too fast and embarking on an accident. Those campaigns, hard hitting as they are, I'm unapologetic about because we do have to get this message across, not just to those who are the most vulnerable road users, but those who would actually potentially cause incidents in an unintended way. I mean, nobody goes out to intend an accident to happen, but we do have to continue to promote good behaviours on the road network, and that's really important to me.
Can you, Mike, briefly tell us why the traffic index has been removed from TfL scorecard, and what was the reasoning behind this change, and how are you actually accurately tracking mode share targets?
Sorry, I missed what was missing from the TfL. I'm so sorry, Chair. I missed what you said was missing from the...
The traffic index.
So well, look, these are headline measures. These are, the core measures that we track on a regular basis across the over TfL. There are, of course, sub-measures that we measure within the individual business. Traffic levels, it's really important to me that the success of the ultra-low emission zone in terms of the reduction in the number of private hire vehicles, for example, coming into the central part of London, that we've been tracking well on that and making progress on that. It's why it's really important to continue to promote investment in the public transport network to ensure that we continue to do everything we can to reduce traffic levels in our city. And it's, partly, of course, it's environmental, partly it's air quality, but also it's really important that, given the government's announcement this morning on diesel and petrol vehicles, it's really important that any private vehicles, private individual-owned vehicles, that we have a proper strategic approach to that. And the more people we can encourage to use public transport, the better. And that's again why I think one of the things I'll be saying to my successor is we need to do much more engagement with outer London boroughs on the delivery of the Mayor's Transport Strategy, because while it's easy for inner London and central London to see how you can have that mode shift and how you can encourage a further increase from the 63% walking, cycling and public transport journeys at the moment up to 80%. It's much more difficult actually in outer London, because in that regard, there is not always an immediate viable alternative available. And that's why the 7 new bus routes that we put in to support some of the growth areas in outer London are so important.
Okay. Let's move on to budget finance related questions. Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you very much, Chair. So, can I ask you, why and by how much have you reduced your 2019-2020 budget for new capital investment, including Crossrail, and what are the main reductions?
So, I think, first of all, just worth saying that our like-for-like operating costs are 200 million lower than they were in 2015-16. So we've had a huge improvement in our operating budget position, so much so that we are still on track to deliver a surplus by 2022-2023. That is a year later than I would have sought to do. Actually, Crossrail doesn't have an impact in this regard, because the funding of Crossrail is coming from an agreement with the government and with the GLA to ensure that the financing costs of Crossrail from a capital perspective are passed through from a loan to the GLA in the case of the GLA bit, and a direct loan to us for some of the further incremental costs. So that hasn't had an impact. The other things that have changed actually are not material this year. So last year we did announce, as you will know, that we weren't going to proceed with Camden and Holborn Station. We did also announce that we weren't going to be able to at this stage proceed with the additional trains for the Jubilee and Northern Line. And we also said that we weren't at this point in a position to go ahead with the procurement of the Piccadilly line signalling, which I mentioned in my opening comments. So this year there haven't actually been material changes. We over the next 5 years will be investing on average 1.3 billion a year on new capital investment, but we do continue to need certainty going forward on the fiscal devolution model for London to ensure that we can let contracts for those longer term projects, because there is a risk, Chair, through you, that we end up back in a cycle of annual certainty of our capital programme, which of course makes no sense when you've got very long-term projects to deliver.
No, I do have sympathy in relation to long-term surety around planning, and I do think the government should give 3 to 5 year commitments on a rolling basis, really.
Yes,
But how does changing your budget halfway through the financial year improve your financial control?
Well, because basically we've been more demanding on ourselves. So this is the equivalent of the goalpost narrowing and being moved further away. With the CFO, we looked at this as part of it. So I do quarterly financial, detailed, deep dive financial reviews with all parts of our business, whether it's on the capital side or on the operating side. And we determined actually, because we were outperforming in our financial targets this year, it's important to give more stretching targets to the team. And that's because it's materially important for us to achieve that operating surplus by 2022-23, as I've said, on the basis that that will directly contribute to how the credit ratings rate us overall. And they've held up our rating pretty well, actually, in the last year, despite all the challenges and headwinds we've seen. But it's materially important that we do hit that target so that we can continue to borrow at competitive rates on the bond market, which we do.
So at Q2, TfL's underspend was 207 million. How much would it have been at Q3 against the original budget, and how has the underspend been utilised?
Well, I can't tell you the detail of that, but I can certainly write to you with that specific
Thank
detail
you,
of what it
that'd
would
be
have been,
great.
because we immediately started using the new targets. So I'm not avoiding the question. It's just that
sure,
that's not the language that I use. So in fact, and in terms of the underspend being utilised, it is important to acknowledge that the one bit of Crossrail, of course, that the direct cost comes to us for is on the revenue loss. So it is true to say that we're talking in the order over the whole period, because of the delay of Crossrail, of the order of 1.3 billion short on revenue than we would have had the Crossrail central section and then the corresponding outer sections opened when was originally planned by the previous Crossrail team. So that is a material issue. So it's not so much that we've got this spare cash sitting around to spend on other things. It's actually trying to address that particular headwind, as well as that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the 700 million on average that we don't get from central government for operating spend, although we planned for that, of course, that's still material. And the other thing is that the uncertainty of the economy has had an impact in terms of tube revenue in particular. Tube revenue is particularly of importance because the yield is higher than it is on buses. So although we still had our busiest day ever on the tube, for example, before Christmas on Black Friday, there have been actually, even week by week, some quite interesting fluctuations in tube demand, and particularly we keep a close eye on discretionary evening and weekend off-peak journeys on the tube, because that can make a material difference to our revenue stream. So we're keeping a very close eye on that. So it's not that we've suddenly flushed with this spare cash. I know you didn't say that, but just to be clear, it's not what's happened.
I'm going to ask you another detailed question here, and I would be surprised if you can give me an answer off the top of your head on this one. Under your financial scorecard measures, what is the basis of your period 9 and year-to-date investment programme targets? Why do these figures not align with those reported in the CFO's Q3 2019/20 quarterly performance report that went to the TF board on the 22nd of January?
Well, I don't know, but I'll go back and I'll go back and
Perhaps we could give you that question written as well, Mike.
I'll go back and give the CFO some direct feedback. Let me put it that way. Yeah.
I, of course, thought of that off the top of my
We
head.
thought you'd be up to date with everything
Well,
and come prepared. Exactly.
yeah.
Okay, I've got another one. This might be a bit easier. How do you account for overperforming on budget milestones despite significantly underspending against the original 2019/20 capital budget?
Well, I think there's some differences here between as I tried to say earlier on, not very eloquently. I do recognise that some of these do relate to different phasing of spend. So, if I can just give you a couple of examples, in our major projects area, there's a year-to-date variance of 13 million. Now that relates to the contractor's latest perspective of when they will actually require the drawdown of the money. Some of it's been rephased into later years. Some of that is because of ongoing commercial discussions we've had with the contractors, and some of it is just literally a phasing of when work is done on the ground and when commissioning phases take place. There's also been, for example, in the same regard, 6 million less spent on major stations following a deferred property purchase for the potential Camden Town upgrade, which again I alluded to earlier on, and also a slightly later formal closeout of the Victoria Station works. So although it's by and large fully commissioned, the Victoria Station, actually the way the flow of money goes to the contractor has had some variation in it as well. So actually those are, in the individual capital spend pots, they're actually quite low variances, but they do sort of have in the amalgam quite a significant impact when you look at them overall. It's why, by the way, Chair, if I may through you, that the whole concept of what a rather clumsy term of over-programming is so important in this regard. So whether it's in this aspect or whether it's on something like healthy streets, which I suspect we may get to a bit later on, it's really important that we have enough kind of sweeping up projects behind, ready to go, to ensure that we effectively do deliver what we can if we get into particular problems with, in the case of healthy streets, for example, some borough consent issues being delayed or some neighbour interventions, which does happen from time to time. It's not because anyone's doing anything wrong, it's just because that's the nature of doing proper consultations at very local level. So some of the variations are really in that level of detail, Chair, through you, and it's you know, it is something we keep a very close handle on.
Thank you. So, where we come out on all of this is, looks as though we may have a 1.88 billion in cash floating around. Have you any plans for that?
Well, it won't be floating around again. Just to be very clear, the days when my predecessor, or indeed his predecessor, were accused of having buckets of cash are not the case. I have never seen any bucket of cash in TfL. We are obliged to hold a minimum level of cash that ensures we are able to pay our bills, pay our wages for basically a 2-month period, and you know, that is conventional for any business, whether it's in the public or private sector, and it's really important that we don't assume that we're flush with cash to spend on other things. Some of this is phasing, but some of this is genuinely allocated funding that we have to have in reserve, because if we didn't have that level of sort of very short-term reserve, then actually our creditors, the financial rating agencies would certainly have something to say about it, and that wouldn't be helpful for our ability to competitively borrow.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move slightly off that subject now. How do you think TfL should work to improve its organisation responsiveness to data and information requests from stakeholders?
So I think I kind of touched on this, Chair, through you earlier
done,
on.
sorry.
We asked that one
Yeah.
already.
Oh yeah, it's done already. Sorry, my apologies. Okay, so now then, I want to look at the R2CW. So for those people listening, that's the Rotherhithe to Canary Wharf ferry service. How much do you think that's going to cost Londoners?
Well, I don't have the exact figure at the moment, and the reason for that is that this is in the early stages. We're looking at what land purchases may be required and where those land purchases would be, particularly on the south side of the river. We're also exploring what sort of technology might be applied and what the market could deliver in terms of the greenest possible ferry. Actually, it's quite challenging because there aren't, when you look around the world, easily deliverable green ferries at the moment, so we might have to consider whether we at least explore the options for some hybrid ferries in this regard. So there is a sort of headline number allocated to in the business plan, but it is very much at a working level and just for some of the early stages of exploration of this. My imperative is to get on with this as quickly as I can, notwithstanding some of the challenges with the land purchase and with some of the other commercial issues. It's pleasing to see that we have got good support, for example, from Canary Wharf on the north side, and I'm sure we'll get on and deliver this, and it will be a great boost for access across the river at that location.
So you have a figure allocated for it. Have you an additional contingency figure for that?
Well, not yet.
And then do you have the other contingency that you'll need on top of that?
Well, not yet. But of course, the business plan is a 5-year rolling plan. So I'm convinced that we have enough in the plan for next year and for what we can envisage for the following 4 years. But clearly, were we to be in a more developed state, which we will be by this time next year, then the business plan will reflect that. This is a real priority, just for the avoidance of doubt. This is absolutely something we want to do.
So as a priority, when do you see people actually being able to use the ferry?
Well, again, that depends on the technology, and I'm not trying to be evasive here. It genuinely is a discussion that we're having ourselves with the supply chain, with potential manufacturers, with potential operators as well, actually, is how quickly we can do it. So I've said, I pushed my team, I'm sure if they were here they would say this, very hard on pinning them down to a date, but what I don't want to do is give an artificially optimistic date here that can't be delivered because we haven't done all the groundwork yet. There is more work to do before I can categorically tell you that.
Okay. And while we're on ferries, Woolwich Ferry is a bit of a debacle, isn't it?
Yeah, it's been we've had real challenges with Woolwich Ferry, I think, on two aspects. One is in the operation of it and some of the challenges around the way it's been operated, and one is there certainly have been challenges with the performance of the new technology and the new much greener, cleaner boats. I have to say, ships are supposed to be called, I think. But we have had some challenges with that technology, there is no doubt. We're in a much better place now in terms of its performance than it had been in the early months, but still not good enough. There's regular high-level meetings with the operator. We've been involved with those who designed the technology, particularly this magnetic system that docks the ferries at both sides of the river, in conversation with them. And obviously it's of huge disappointment to me that the performance has been the way it is, and I know it's been very difficult for people who rely on it every day.
So on that magnetic technology, would you say you had a positive or a negative experience with that?
Good question. It's been pretty negative, actually, but you do need negative and positive with magnets, don't you? Yeah.
I'm going to leave it at that, I think. Yeah. So I've got someone else asking about tubes, haven't we? Yeah.
All right. I'm going to ask the one about passenger journey experience.
Yeah, I can do. I wasn't sure whether you wanted to pick that up, actually, in your bit.
You want me to do it?
Yeah, if you want. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'll pick that bit up then. Just want to really understand from you, Mike, what are the risks to passenger journeys over the next 12 months?
So I think you mean in terms of numbers of?
Yes, and the impact on the budget.
Yeah. So I think there is a real risk. I think, as I said earlier on, the risk would be on the macroeconomic impact predominantly. So as I said, we've seen some very good numbers overall in the tube recovering during the year, but actually there have been some real blips. We've had some very difficult weeks. For example, in the immediate post-Christmas period, there was real uncertainty out there in the economy. We can see, and of course, the interesting thing is we are a bit of a lead economic indicator in this regard. So I can see after every morning peak the number of taps in and taps out at Bank Monument Station or at Canary Wharf, and I can see on a Saturday evening how many taps in and taps out there's been at Leicester Square. So you get a real sense of how the market is performing, which is why I mentioned earlier on these discretionary evening and weekend leisure trips is one of the big issues we've got to continue to work on, and in particular, ensuring that the message goes out there that London is open for business, that the great things that London has to offer, and the people from the wider southeast should come in and use London. Now, there's been some help, I have to say, with some of the improvements we've seen year on year on, for example, Thameslink services, where there were some real challenges last year. On the other hand, of course, we had a long-running industrial dispute on South Western Railways in the month of December. So all of these, and actually that was an issue where late night services in particular were curtailed and cut back quite early. And again, we've just had a close look at that to see whether that had a material effect on people tapping in at Waterloo and other key interchange places like Vauxhall and other places. So this is a very volatile situation we're in now. One would hope now that we've finally got to a situation where we've left the European Union and therefore there's some kind of stability ahead in terms of how the economy might view itself, who knows, then that might give a bit more certainty to people in choosing how they're going to travel and what they're going to do. But it is something we continue to keep a close eye on.
That analysis you're doing, I think at some point, obviously you're doing that currently,
yeah.
Maybe in the summer, it might be for the next committee, it might be useful for us to get a briefing and understand what trends you're seeing.
I think that's true, and I think again, if I look at bus ridership as well, which is a whole.
I think we're going to come on to that later.
Okay,
so
sure,
maybe
sure.
Hold that
Okay,
there.
I'll hold that for now. Yeah.
Mike, morning. Just to ask a question about tube ridership. You made a comment about the economy, but of course, from an employment point of view, London economy has been performing very strongly,
yes.
but yet ridership has been going down.
Yes.
So how does that figure into your analysis?
Well, I think that goes back to what I was saying, which is that it doesn't seem to be on the core economic issues about morning and evening peaks, so Monday to Friday evening peak. It does much more seem to be the volatility in the discretionary journeys, which are the evening ones or the weekend leisure ones. So those are people, just to give you a real specific example, these are people who live outside of London, who don't necessarily use the tube on a Monday to Friday basis, but choose to come in to see people or to see the great things that London has to offer in the evening or weekends. And there is some evidence that the volatility is created by some people making the decision not to do that in a way that they might not have made those decisions before. So it's not necessarily about the business performance of London, if you like. It's more about the volatility of people outside London making the decision to come in.
I suppose it'd be really interesting to see this analysis, because you talked about Brexit, which is probably you'd think would be focused on the business end, which is doing well. So I want to see why that factors into your answer, but how it actually factors into your analysis.
I think it is fair to say, and that's why the analysis is important. And by the way, Chair, through you, I'm very happy to commit to that information coming back, that analysis coming back in due course when it's completed. But I think it is fair to say that the volatility we're seeing is much more marked than we have experienced in the last 10, 15 years. Apart from the blip we saw in 2008 with the financial crisis there, we've always been in a sort of steady state increase in demand on the tube. Now, we're still in an increased demand. We're still in 1.5% up year on year. So I don't want to give a depressing story, but we are at the more pessimistic end of where our forecast was. You quite rightly, as an assembly, actually I think it's the Budget and Performance Committee, have pushed me previously to ensure that I'm not overly bullish about demand forecasts.
I think that's the point I'm getting to. Is this a trend, or is it the new plateau? And the estimates have sometimes looked sunny. It is very sunny.
Well, we couldn't have been more cloudy than we were this year, to be honest. I mean, so I think I would have struggled to be more pessimistic this year. Now, as it turns out, where we are at the moment, we're not far off that quite pessimistic perspective. But again, the detail is in the detail, if you like, and so I'm very happy to commit to come back with that.
Okay, Deputy Chair, back to you.
One more question on this, and I'm going to move on to the next section. But I wanted to ask you, you touched on the spending review in your opening remarks. You talked about some of the big projects that aren't funded. What will be your big ask of government in this spending review?
So the big ask is really to commit to a continuation of the fiscal devolution, of retained business rates, and ensuring that actually the Mayor has the ability, therefore, to get some of this certainty that actually Assembly Member Prince alluded to in terms of, I think you said, 3 to 5 years or whatever, in terms of the type of certainty that Highways England have, the type of certainty that Network Rail have, the type of certainty that we have historically had, to allow us to, number one priority, let me be absolutely clear, signalling on the Piccadilly line. The trains themselves give, the 94 new trains give an increase in capacity of 12%, but you get 60%, 60% overall. I mean, that's like a new line. It's like an entirely new service in London. And I think, just continuing to make that point, I've been meeting with transport ministers. I've been meeting with, as recently as last week, I had a meeting with our major suppliers to ensure they help make that case as well. And this, of course, by the way, is not at the expense of other parts of the UK, because these trains, the direct result of ordering the new trains in the Piccadilly line is building a factory in Goole. Well, that's not in London when I last checked. And that will support jobs, growth, the subsystem suppliers and everything else in that part of England, quite rightly so. And also will give an opportunity for Siemens, in this case, to then bid for manufacturing trains more widely in the UK going forward. So it's a good news story nationally. We've got to continue to make that point.
So is your ask far more about upgrading and investing in the existing infrastructure rather than putting Crossrail 2 as the ask, protect the route, whatever, but given where we are with Crossrail, are you focusing more, and is that more sellable to government than another new line for London?
Well, I think possibly you're right, and I think we shouldn't make the assumption that the tube upgrade is done. I think broadly, without being trite about this, one of the challenges that I say to the team that run the Piccadilly line is that because a train sort of vaguely trundles along every 2 or 3 minutes, and most of the time it kind of works, is it's less in your face than it was in the years of the Northern Line that I referred to earlier on, where the people could see the massive gap between what was required and what is now being delivered. But the Piccadilly line, just imagine the Piccadilly line like the Victoria line, that kind of, one every, minute and a half kind of service throughout the day. That would make a massive difference given where the Piccadilly line serves. So I think we really have to remind people the tube upgrade isn't complete. We certainly have to continue to explore what opportunities they are, particularly for imaginative funding routes for something like the Bakerloo line upgrade and the Bakerloo line extension, because that is one where we have gone to consultation recently, as you know, with a very significant and very favourable response to what we're talking about in terms of line of route and station locations. So I think we have to continue to make that case. Thamesmead extension of the DLR, again, massive opportunity for housing and homes, and I'm sure the prospective new Deputy Mayor for Housing will be interested in that prospect as well going forward. I'm sure there'll be conversations in due course in that regard. But it is really important. I mean, these are hugely important schemes, but we've got to also keep the core running, because nobody will ever forgive us if on our watch collectively we allow a degradation of existing operations.
Well, it may be, Chair, that we could write to government supporting, if we can understand fully, the idea of longer term investment and investing in the existing infrastructure. Yeah. Maybe we could write. Well, I'd be very happy to work with you in terms of, because I do think as I said earlier on, I do think we've genuinely got common cause, and you have been, as a committee in whatever guise over the last 20 years, hugely supportive of those arguments.
Yeah, I think let's take that on board as a package. Yeah, thank you, Mike. Assemblymember McCartney.
I wanted to come in on the Piccadilly line because I've been imagining that wonderful service for quite a while. And actually, the changeover at Finsbury Park from the Victoria to the Piccadilly is actually very stark. But you're quite right. I mean, you've put the contract out for the 94 new trains. I think you're envisaging the first ones being on the line in 2023, but they'll be operating on an old signalling system. It just seems completely bonkers.
I couldn't have put it better myself.
Okay, fine. And I was going to make the point as well about those 2,000 jobs for over a decade guaranteed in a different part of the country, and about London sharing its infrastructure benefits a bit more widely. But the existing trains are obviously 50 years old. Yes. They need being replaced. But also, for my part of North London, this is our main route into Heathrow, biggest airport, and it's also the most affordable route to Heathrow as well. Is that a case you're making to government?
Well, it is, and you will recall that one of the arguments we made in response to the Davis Commission's input into the Davis Commission was that we thought that there was an understatement of the public transport provision in terms of how the Davis Commission reported on the expansion of Heathrow. I think where we do have common calls with Heathrow, by the way, and I will call them out favourably in this regard, is that we all think that regardless of the size of Heathrow, it needs to be better served by public transport capable journeys. And if you consider that already, even in the state it's in now, the Piccadilly line, just the Piccadilly line, carries more people to Heathrow than any other railway does to any other airport anywhere in the world, then the argument is slam dunk to improve this. So even when we get the Elizabeth line fully serving Heathrow directly from the city, the West End, Canary Wharf, even then there will be an absolute imperative to ensure that the Piccadilly line is fit for purpose. And of course, as you well know, knowing the Piccadilly line, where it's not just Heathrow, it's the new business areas and commercial and leisure areas of King's Cross, it's the heart of the West End, it's other growing areas, Hammersmith and other places on the city that are so important to be decently connected for people who want affordable, decent journeys to get across the city.
Thank you. And whatever we can do, we'll support that case.
Thank you. Thank you.
Assemblymember Arbour.
Yes. I've listened to you with your vision of the Piccadilly line, the train coming like this. That would be the most extraordinary sort of dream for the people who stand on Turnham Green railway station and they watch the trains rushing through and not stopping there. and there has been a vision for as long as I've been a member of this Assembly that trains should stop at Turnham Green. Now, would it be true to say that had there not been a fares freeze, TfL would have had the money to improve the signalling and the other technological bits and pieces which will be required to permit Piccadilly line trains to stop at Turnham Green?
No, absolutely. Well, first of all, it wouldn't have happened now, regardless. Because those things take much longer to procure and to deliver. And secondly, the fares freeze is a drop in the ocean in terms of the required capital spend. It wouldn't have come anywhere close. It would have covered a very small, tiny percentage of the capital spend required for delivering the upgrade on the Piccadilly line. And also, I would just say, and as a response to your colleague to your left, Assemblymember Bailey, in this regard as well, that the fares freeze, of course, and there is some evidence to support this if I compare it with the train operating companies where there hasn't been a fare freeze, there does appear to have been some softening of demand falls on TfL services because people have been able to access services because there is a more affordable fare structure in place. So, you know, this does work. The elasticities work both ways in this regard, as you would expect.
Well, I don't know that I do expect it, because you've just been giving us this stuff about the Piccadilly line being completely overloaded, the large numbers of people who are going to Heathrow, making it the busiest line. It's a good statistic, you know. It's a good line of patter, but as I say, it doesn't please the residents of Chiswick.
I accept that. Just on Turnham Green, let me just be absolutely clear on Turnham Green, because I've of course said this before. There's nothing I want more than the Piccadilly line to be able to stop at Turnham Green. We do need the signalling upgrade for this. There is no situation, regardless of any timeline, even if we had immediate certainty to procure the Piccadilly line, there is no prospect of that having been delivered right now. You can't do it that quickly. You can't deliver it that quickly. What we do need now is to ensure, exactly as Assemblymember McCartney said so eloquently, is what you do need now is to ensure that we don't have years and years of delivery of the Piccadilly line new train, and not a signalling to enhance the service going forward. And you know, we have common cause in that regard, I'm sure. Well,
obviously, I understand that. But if the work of procurement had been done on the basis of secure income and funding being allocated to the thing some years ago, in other words, we wouldn't be starting from here.
Well, we wouldn't be starting from here
already.
No, we wouldn't have been starting from here if we hadn't lost 700 million of operating subsidy from the government. We wouldn't be starting from here if we hadn't faced some of those other economic headwinds that I referred to. But the fact is we are. The fact is, as I've said earlier on, we do need this certainty, which, by the way, I'm really encouraged by the Prime Minister talking about levelling up. There was no prospect of London not getting support in the forthcoming spending review or budget. And, you know, I'm encouraged that the Prime Minister, of course, having been the Mayor of London, will have a very great understanding of the opportunities that that levelling up means rather than levelling down.
Well, you've diverted from this. I get very cross about this mantra from TfL, and I suspect all of us do, about the loss of the 700 million. Of course, the changes in the business rate, meaning extra funding.
No, but it's net 700 million. To be clear, it's net 700 million loss. It's not, that's taking account of the business rate.
Nevertheless, there has been additional funding given to this place via the business rate. The reckless proposals made by the current mayor to say that he is going to continue this freeze on fares is going to make the prospect of improvement on the Piccadilly line, and indeed other infrastructure improvements right across TfL, even more distant. Nobody runs a business on the basis that they cannot increase their revenue.
So you will see the assumptions we've made, and I'm sure you've read it carefully, the assumptions we've made in our business plan just published. Clearly, the fares policy is an issue for the mayor, and whoever is elected mayor in May, I'm no doubt will direct us accordingly.
Yeah. Well, I'll leave it at that, Chairman.
Thank you. Let's move on. Everyone's favourite topic, that's Crossrail.
Yeah, let's look at Crossrail. I think we'll try and get some pace here. We can tell there's an election coming, lots of people wanting to make points. But let's look at Crossrail. You talked about earlier wanting the culture needed to change. You talked about the board not holding the executive to account properly in the past, and so on, some of the things that we flagged in our report. But clearly you're not going to be in office when Crossrail does eventually open. So what safeguards are you putting in place to ensure that this new culture of transparency you talked about and some of the other important changes is driven by your successor?
Well, it's a very good point. I mean, first of all, just a couple of comments on transparency, because I know this has been a continued theme that people around this table have raised. I think it's worth noting that prior to October 2018, there was almost always, prior to October 2018, almost always a sort of closed session of the wider TfL board to have a discussion on the commercially sensitive issues around Crossrail. That hasn't happened at all since October 2018. Every single session of the TfL board has been entirely open and public, and the whole discussion on Crossrail has been taking place in that regard. And I know you will know that because you have attended many of those board meetings yourself. I would also say that the other difference fundamentally, which I would seek to ensure continues from my successor, is at the end of every Crossrail board, the joint sponsors attend the Crossrail board meeting for an update from every single non-executive director of Crossrail and the chief executive. So there's a roundtable discussion, very much like this, a roundtable discussion where the chair opens, then there's a huge discussion, a detailed discussion, I should say, from other board members. I have attended every single one of those, bar one. There was one I didn't attend, which was July last year, where I happened to be on holiday, but I came back actually from holiday for the August one because it was an important one in terms of some discussion on funding. And somebody senior from the Department for Transport usually always attends as well. So there's a really important kind of different perspective. That never would have happened in the previous operation of Crossrail and the way it was done. So that gives you a very clear indication of how things are going, both on the delivery schedule, on the cost that's required, both the capital cost and where we are going forward. We've recently hired for Crossrail and jointly for Crossrail a new CFO for them, who's actually a TfL employee, but she has been seconded over to Crossrail. I have the highest regard for her, and her experience in this is fantastic. She's already hit the ground running. Our CFO, Simon Killenbach, attended the board before last of Crossrail in its entirety to ensure that there's proper recognition from the Crossrail board of the imperative of the revenue coming in as a delivery schedule of this. And I meet on a weekly basis with the chair of Crossrail to have a discussion of current and prevalent issues, as well as, of course, well, more than once a week I always talk to the chief executive. So there's a hugely different set of discussions and interfaces going on than there were before. Added to that, just if I may, sorry, I don't mean to be verbose here, but added to that, the managing director of London Underground has, since his arrival, also put in place some new arrangements within TfL Core. So he has he's appointed to a new position, Peter McNaught, who's his Director of Asset Maintenance, to be in charge of pulling in the Elizabeth line into operational railway service. And that is around saying, well, what does it actually need, for example, for the line of route or for Tottenham Court Road Station to be commissioned into operational readiness right now in preparation for the opening that the chief executive has said will be next summer. So there's a push and pull issue here that's very important.
And your advice to your successor is that they take over all those systems and potentially add to them?
Well, absolutely. So I would say, Chair, through you, that probably about 30 to 35% of my time is now spent on Crossrail Elizabeth Line matters. And given that it's the largest addition to London's public transport network in recent history, I think that's an imperative that I would certainly encourage my successor to continue.
Okay, picking up a few other things, you talked about transparency, but the project representative reports, these Jacobs report, actually, though there's a lot of acronyms in them, there's a lot of detail in there that's very useful. But they're so late in going up online. I mean, the latest one we've got is from mid-November, but that's actually for the period September to October, so it's 3.5 months out of date. But it's How can you get those up in a more timely manner to show that you are being truly transparent?
Well, I think that's a very good pushback, and I'll take that away. There's no reason why we shouldn't do. I think as soon as I've seen them and as soon as they've been seen by the joint sponsors who they're commissioned for, there's no reason why we shouldn't very quickly get them online. I mean, I have to say, this is not because of Jacobs, I would say. I've been somewhat frustrated that they come to me usually about 2 days before the board. And of course, they're the Crossrail board, they're a huge source of information for me to ensure that I'm informed, or at least it helps me being informed to probe the directors and probe the executive of Crossrail and some of the key issues that they raise. So I think there's definitely got to be a way of speeding that up. I think at the hearing before Christmas, the chief executive of Crossrail, in a similar but parallel regard, committed that his monthly update to the chair of this committee would be much more timely. So I think this is a similar issue, which I will just give another push for. It's a very fair question.
Thank you very much. Why are you confident that the improved governance structure that you've outlined is going to ensure the project's successful delivery?
Well, because I see a discipline of process, thought and delivery and tracking that is materially different to what I saw previously. So what you see now is at a very granular level. You see the detailed plan for individual stations of when they're commissioned, both into basic safety system viability, which allows you to go into this rather complex arrangement called trial running, allows that, right through to when it gets to the ability for passengers to use those stations fully, and therefore the full trial operations and ultimately opening of the stations. So I see it for stations, shafts and portals. I see it for the core line of route through the centre of London, the traces it's called, the sort of railway itself. I see it for all the integrated systems such as the platform screen doors, the station control systems, so-called SCADA systems. I see all of that as well. I see a much more collaborative piece of work with Network Rail. As recently as last week, Andrew Haynes, the Chief Executive of Network Rail, and myself had a briefing from both our respective teams on the interfaces and what they're working together on, both the control rooms and indeed on the transition points to the east and west of the core tunnel section. So I just see that level of granular detail that, while it may have been there in some aspects before, wasn't as clearly presented, it wasn't presented in as much detail to give the confidence, as I said, as I alluded to earlier on, that the sub-programs, the individual sub-programs of this overall project are being worked to.
In terms of the project's completion date, Mark Wilder said next summer.
For the central section,
For the central section, yes. Your budget projections suggest autumn, which is you being cautious. So if it's earlier, that's a bonus to you. Can you give us any assurance around the completion date and also about the current final cost commitment?
Well, on terms of the completion date, I would just say that I am confident, given the information I have to hand right now, that is an achievable date for next summer. And I'm also confident that then, when you take it forward, gives an overall opening with the two ends feeding straight through the tunnel for the following summer. So that's summer 2022, and that's, I think, what Mark Wilder said in public, and I would concur. There is a credible plan that takes us to that point. On the funding, so the chair of Crossrail has been very direct, both publicly in front of the Assembly, but also to me in private and at the Crossrail board, that he is not going to seek any more capital funding beyond where we are now. So that additional funding, the latest projection on funding of where we are, is I believe where we will end up going. And the reason he's more confident about that, and I think is able to make that assertion, I don't want to put words in his mouth here, but it is because the major build work is substantively complete. So there isn't this major, therefore, additional capital spend foreseen in any regard. The testing and commissioning of the signalling systems, the Bombardier and Siemens signalling systems, which we're very well familiar with, is progressing well. We're running these. The latest software drop from Siemens. I went out to Germany with Mark Wilde just before Christmas to have a look at the work they were doing on the signalling system at Siemens. Very impressive it was as well. And that latest software drop has gone very well, actually exceeded expectations in terms of how it's delivered so far. Of course, there will always need to be little iterations, and lines of software code will have faults in them, because any software does. But actually, it's quite a positive story there. So for both those reasons, both for the train systems reason and for the core construction perspective, I think that's why the chair has been very explicit about not needing any more money, and I see there is some evidence to back up his confidence.
But there's up to 650 million you have, which is new money that hasn't been agreed yet. Where are you with those discussions with DFT?
So we've been having positive discussions. I know there's been some meetings just in the last couple of days at political level. I've been talking regularly with the Permanent Secretary, and we've been talking with Treasury officials in that regard, and there are some technical issues around repayment schedules and how that could all work. I mean, I absolutely recognise, and again, it's worth me saying publicly on record, that London will bear the additional cost of the additional capital required for this. But the point is, it is material as to what the repayment profile of that is, to ensure that it doesn't eat into the other core priorities that I've alluded to earlier on for TfL.
So London is going to pick up the borrowing costs for up to 650 million.
Yeah, London will. The Mayor's always been clear, and I think the government's always been clear, that London picks up the cost. I mean, of course, I would like there to be a wider contribution. I mean, one of the things that, if we had to live our lives again, is the benefit that Crossrail gives beyond the London boundary for many people and many businesses beyond London who have not, in the way that London businesses have so explicitly contributed to its build costs. So, but I think, as I say, the important thing is in the mechanics. It's a bit dull and boring, but the mechanics, the formula of the payment schedules that would be required going forward.
And then in terms of your successor, obviously they've got to communicate risks between their role and the Mayor's office, crucial to the project's success. Yeah. How will this be maintained or improved, do you think, or could it be improved by your successor? The balance, sorry, just to be clear in the question, sorry. The communication of risks between the Commissioner as a sponsor with the Mayor. Yeah,
I think it's all about full openness, full reveal, full everything else. And I think again the tenor, the nature of the briefings that the Mayor has with the Crossrail team now, where I am in every one of those briefings, is an entirely different tone than we had before. It used to be of that tone. If I go back to the previous mayoralty, it used to be in the early stages of the previous mayoralty, a very direct, open discussion. That seemed to sort of decline over time, and I think it goes back to the refreshing of a board and the refreshing of an executive that you require at different stages of the delivery programme. But the chief executive of Crossrail is a world-renowned signalling systems integration leader, and there aren't many people who have that sort of CV attached to them, and he knows nothing else other than to be open, in my experience of him, and that of course helps in that regard. The Commissioner, I will always recommend, is in the same room for the same discussions at the same time that the Mayor hears them.
And then just finally on this, your other learning for other major projects. You're going off to chair a major project. There are other projects we would like to see, whether it's Bakerloo Line Extension, Crossrail 2, whatever. What are your sort of top few takeaways that you would encourage your successor or anyone else leading on these projects to build in?
Well, I think there's certainly some things about the structure going forward. So, if you look at the way that Crossrail was initially set up in 2008 as a kind of rather, very, although wholly owned subsidiary of TfL, a very arm's length project with a level of scrutiny and oversight of the Chief Executive, which in effect the Commissioner is in this regard. The Group Chief Executive had very limited levers to which to either see into the project or indeed to get information other than when there were some specific things, very statutorily outlined things, such as a breach of interim funding levels or whatever. It was only then that you really got a sense of huge transparency there. Things like the compensation paid to the executive team, or even the hiring of the executive team, wasn't something that that TfL was involved with, nor really was the DFT, to be honest. So it was a real challenge. So I think there's got to be a much more clear line of sight from a project delivery team from its inception. And then there's the whole issue about the type of procurement model you put in place, how you ensure there is sufficient incentivization for the supply chain to deliver. You don't need to reconfigure incentives over time if things go wrong, or if there needs to be some additional incentives to complete the project. You don't have to redo that all the time. Now, you can never have perfect foresight in these things, but I think having sufficient risk provision built in and sufficient foresight of the potential of these things happening is really important. This is again, I would just say, Chair, through you, this is a fantastic world-beating project. And when it is open, we will, yes. I hope you're all there, I hope I might even get invited to the opening, we will all look at it and say how wonderful this is. But when this was originally envisaged, it was seen as building a tunnel through London, fantastic in itself, and then seen as a railway commissioning project. But that was very much the second order thing that wasn't really at the centre of people's minds when we did this. And, by the way, the previous chair of Crossrail, the previous executive team of Crossrail, did a fantastic job in many respects to get that first phase done. The trick is how over time you gradually shift the balance for this to be a project that is its only measure of success is about having real fare-paying passengers on real seats on a real operating railway. And if you lose that sight of what you're trying to do, you can easily distract yourselves, not intentionally, with some of the intricacies of the complexity of the engineering and not think of people.
Okay, thank you very much.
Briefly, I'd like to move on, Mike, to HS2, obviously controversial and a lot of back and forth. The review, again, you hear about lots of leaks and editing, re-editing, etc. From the position you are, what are your thoughts on HS2?
Well, so I'm very supportive of HS2, serving London and linking London with the other great cities of the north of England. I think it's a real imperative, just for the avoidance of doubt, that it serves right into the heart of London, into Euston. I think there had previously been some talk about it not coming the whole way into Euston. I think that would be a very poor outcome. It needs to serve Euston. Not least because, by the way, going back to the Elizabeth line, if it does just terminate at Old Oak Common, then actually a lot of the benefits you get from the Elizabeth line coming in through Old Oak Common into other parts of London get diluted because the capacity is significantly reduced, the ability of people to get on Crossrail trains there, or indeed at Paddington. So for me, it's really important. For me, it's I can't comment on all the costing issues around HS2. Another thing, I don't have the direct line of sight of that, but strategically, and also, of course, from a supply chain perspective, from ensuring that there is certainty of a pipeline of projects for those who are building trains, building signalling systems, doing civil work on such a great line of route as this is, I think there's a real imperative to go ahead with it from my perspective, as from a London perspective.
Mike, I mean, why do you think we are so bloody awful in with strategic projects and getting costing wrong, way beyond the cost projections? You got example of Crossrail, and we've been talking about, and HS2, which according to what we hear, the figures are going to be double the original cost predictions.
Well, I think so first of all, I would just say we are not unique. I think anyone who thinks that this is a unique characteristic to London or the UK, it's simply not the case. This does happen everywhere. I mean, I could mention a particular airport in Germany that still hasn't opened after sort of 10 years beyond when it should have done. There are very, large issues in that regard. There were clearly issues in the history of this country as well, and jointly with France on the Channel Tunnel and other major projects in the past. But there are projects all over the world where this happens, possibly with the exception of China, where I think slightly different paradigms exist, if I may say. But certainly, look, one of the challenges is how we are seeming capable always of learning the lessons from things that have happened before. And there's a really important point in that regard. One of the reasons we don't learn the lessons in what's gone before is that we have very much operated in this country these major infrastructure projects in a spike and trough way. And that means we lose the talent and the resource and the knowledge of people who've been involved previously. So if you don't have people still around, let's say we did go ahead with Crossrail 2, if you don't have people around who could, with the benefit of hindsight, advise on the procurement model for Crossrail 2, given the experience and how it played out with Crossrail 1, then I promise you the same lesson will be learned again. And that's why I really do welcome this levelling up of investment across the country to ensure that the great Northern Powerhouse Rail, or Crossrail 3 or whatever you call it, is delivered in the north. I really recognise that and acknowledge the importance of those schemes across the country to ensure that the supply chain has certainty, that the learning, that people feel they want to be in this country because this country is leading the way on national infrastructure projects going forward, because there is that continual pipeline of projects, not this stop-start that I'm afraid we have seen over the history of London and the UK overall. So we have to learn from ensuring there is continuity of talent, continuity of learning, continuity of delivery. That will make a material difference.
Thank you. Let's move on to tube and rail transport in London. Assembly Member Bailey.
Just before we move on, I look at your characterisation of Crossrail, and you're saying that the first phase was delivered, but it wasn't, because my understanding is stations like Bond Street, the civil works weren't done. That's why why we're going to be maybe 4 years late. So I don't accept that characterisation that the first bit was delivered.
Sorry, to be clear, you're quite right. You're absolutely right. What I was talking about was the construction of the tunnel itself, the core tunnel itself. You're quite right. When you get into other areas of Bond Street Station, or indeed some of the other stations, clearly they weren't fully delivered where they needed to get to. I was just really talking about the core civil engineering, which was the tunnel boring machines building the tunnel through London.
Okay, and my other point would be that the complexities of Crossrail, if we saw Crossrail as a tunnel with a few trains running through it, I think that's what we rely on TfL for, the likes of you, to give us an idea of just what we are taking on in complexity and delivery and cost terms. For me, that is the role, or certainly in this case, the role of Crossrail. So if we all thought it was going to be a simple tunnel, I think Crossrail's at fault. I think TfL bears some of that fault as well.
Well, I think I would love to have been able to be more involved in Crossrail than we were allowed to be in the way that it was set up. And I think that is one of the real issues. Bear in mind, this was set up in the way it was in 2008 explicitly to stop people like me being involved in it.
Well, maybe that's one of the learnings.
It certainly is, and the reason, but it's a serious point, because the reason it was done, I don't, by the way, question the good faith in why that was done. It was done because people said, look, you know what we don't want is people like Peter Hendy or Mike Brown or anybody else interfering in this project. What we need is the very best in the world of the private sector that is going to do this in an entirely different way than the way projects would be delivered in the public sector. That was the reason it was done that way, and I think in retrospect a different balance should and could be struck.
I'm sure there's some agreement of that around this whole shoot. Yeah. But we are going to talk about rail and tube and rail in London. Let me start by saying, has there been any progress on the devolution of national rail commuter services in Greater London to TfL since the publication of the strategic case for metronisation?
So I think the key thing I would say is, and just to remind you, that the benefits of devolution that we've seen on the overground network have been significant. So we've seen passenger numbers rise by nearly 300% on the North London line alone as a result of that. Of devolution. Previously they ran 3 trains an hour, we're now running 10 trains an hour on the core North London line route. That's a significant enhancement from where we were when we started. We've committed to as well work with the Department for Transport on taking over the operation of the routes out of Moorgate, the Great Northern route, so-called out of Moorgate. So that is work that is progressing in that regard. And we've got a piece of work going on with the Department for Transport to work out that being transferred over to us. And you will have seen, I'm sure, that the Secretary of State for Transport made some comments recently around the southeastern routes as well, and what might happen strategically there as well. And I think, to be fair, the government and the Transport Secretary, the new Transport Secretary, has been very public in his desire to see greater devolution of responsibility for rail services to elected mayors, whether it's in London or whether it's anywhere else in the country, and we will continue to work with the Department for Transport in that regard. I mean, clearly we need to make sure it's the right financial model. We need to make sure that we can actively demonstrate improvements in that aspect, and we await with interest, as is everybody else, the report of the Keith Williams review into National Railways, which I hope will be forthcoming quite soon.
So your overview on this would be that it would be so we've seen some improvements in the lines that TfL already control.
Yeah.
You're confident that that would be a straight switch if we were to get more and more devolution, we'd see that uplift?
Well, I think what I'm saying is we'll have to wait and see how the model would be constructed and what would happen. I mean, one of the, look, there is no magic wand that as soon as on day one you take over a rail service you can exercise dramatic improvements. But I would just say that the level of oversight and the level of scrutiny and incentivisation of our model on the operator, with us taking the revenue risk, them not therefore being incentivised to maximise revenue, them being incentivised to maximise service delivery for passengers, has shown some benefit. It's not perfect, but it's shown some benefit. And I know in my intense and quite detailed discussions with Keith Williams as he was carrying out the work that will have fed into his review, that those points were heard very clearly by him. And of course we have the advantage that he, amongst other things in his great career, did sit on the TfL board, so he does have some knowledge of what we do and how we do it.
Okay. Would TfL's financial position be adversely affected by further devolution of national rail services and infrastructure management on what is currently the Network Rail?
To be clear, it's not infrastructure management, so that's never been the model that we've we've embarked on. So the infrastructure, as you will know, remains the responsibility of Network Rail. The involvement that we have is with the concession, with the operator. Okay. So in the case of the existing London Overground network, it's with Arriva Rail London is the company that we interact with. So it wouldn't have the financial impact in terms of cost of infrastructure. Clearly, we would have to work out with the Department for Transport if there's an existing subsidy or an existing financial model that applies for a rail service that they're responsible for now, that money passed through to us. As it did actually for the Overground and for the additional routes, for example, the West Anglia routes that we took over more recently on the Overground, that money did pass through to us. And then if there was additional money to be had, if we felt like we needed to enhance the rolling stock, for example, or do some other further things, then there would be some money required from us at the increment. But that is something that we've made some provision for in our business plan, but clearly until we know the outcome of the Williams report, it's a bit difficult to be categoric about how much would be required.
The Mayor promised that should metroisation go ahead under his mayoralty, he'd be accompanied by a fares freeze. So what you're saying, it sounds like that this would then make that whole financial situation much harder to deal with.
Well, no, I don't think it would make it harder. I think it depends. What I'm saying is it would depend on the model of the transfer of the existing subsidy. If there was a subsidy paid to an existing operator, I would expect, given our discussions with the DfT at sort of nascent level, that subsidy would be transferred over to us. So
that being correct, but having fares freeze will still make that situation significantly more difficult because you'd have much more responsibility for the railway going forward.
Well, I can't, as I say, can't speak for any future mayor and what they might choose to do with fares, but I would just say that there is not going to be further devolution in this mayoralty because that finishes in a few months.
Yeah, amen to that.
Yeah, Assemblymember Bailey, can you just stop there? Assemblymember McCartney.
Thank you. No surprise I want to ask about the Great Northern franchise. I asked a range of questions recently, and I'm pleased to see that you've been working with the DfT now quite closely, and a strategic business case has now been submitted to the Secretary of State, and it's up to him whether he agrees or not. So do you have any indication or any timescales for that decision to be made?
Not categorically, but it is true to say there's been positive dialogue, positive discussions. So, as you rightly say, it's been submitted to the Department for Transport Officials, to the Secretary of State for Transport for consideration. I think it is fair to say that the Department for Transport and the Secretary of State have been rather preoccupied with the scheme that I was asked about earlier on with HS2, and therefore we haven't yet got any categoric answer or indication from him or from officials. But obviously, if approved, we would work with the DFT, Network Rail and the incumbent operator to progress those practical issues that would be associated with transferring the services. But, you know, again, just to be clear, if it was transferred to us, we would seek to provide a more reliable integrated service to passengers. This part of this line of route, as it turns out, used to be part of the London Transport Network in years gone by. So first priority is to deliver the current timetable, absolutely, to an improved level of reliability. And then we'd look and see what other journey times could be reduced, what other services we might be able to enhance, and see what else we can do. But that is sort of the next phase down the line. So you're quite right. We are where we are with the business case being submitted, and we await impatiently for a response.
And of course, being a Welling MP, he has previously called for the line to be devolved to transport for London.
I think he has been reminded of those previous comments.
I've reminded him as well. Obviously, when you took over that part of London Underground that is the Enfield Town Line, there was a dip in performance at that stage, primarily because you were not allowed to inspect the rolling stock at the time and then had to take many of the carriages out of service. So when you do take over any other lines, could you just, I was going to, you know, just is TfL quite clear that they're not going to do it until they have actually inspected and have full access?
Well, I think that's one of the issues around that, you know, it's slightly in code, the many practicalities that we have to look at. So that is one of the things I'd be very keen to look at. And you're quite right. You know, we need to go into this with our eyes wide open as to what are the challenges. And it may well be that we determine that we can still make improvements regardless of the state of the assets and the infrastructure and the trains. But I think you're quite right. We need to, and we have learnt the lessons from the West Anglia routes.
Good. And I was late this morning because of points failures yet again between Finsbury Park and Moorgate. The trains on that line are regularly cancelled or delayed because of lack of driver availability, despite that being what seems to be now a 2-year-old problem. Are you certain that TfL could make great improvements to the current situation?
Well, I think you know, depending on who was our operator, we would clearly, well, in fact, whoever was the operator, we'd be having a very detailed discussion on those issues. I mean, you know, again, I can't comment because I don't know the rostering of the drivers that Greater Thames Link embark on those line of routes.
Enough.
But, well, I think there is, so let me not talk about that specifically, but I think there occasionally is a culture within some national train operating companies where driver rosters are populated a lot by voluntary overtime of drivers. Now, in my experience, that is entirely inappropriate way to roster any function, whether it's drivers, whether it's station staff, whether it's maintenance staff. It doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is not because any individuals are bad people or want to create a problem. It's just because you end up in a cycle of relying on discretionary decisions of every individual all to line up with populating a roster for the number of driving positions you have. So I can't comment as whether that's the case on Great Northern because I genuinely don't know. But I think just philosophically it's not the place to go, and it's not, the basics of operational management would say you should never go down that path.
Good. Well, I'm very glad that you've allocated funding in your business plan for the associated costs with taking over the Great Northern Line, and I'll continue to lobby for that. But thank you for your efforts too.
Well, thanks for your support. Thank you.
Do you want to carry on? Sorry.
I just wanted to pick up something because Assemblymember Bailey asked a question in your answer about devolution, that TfL had never asked about infrastructure management, but actually TfL's submission to the Williams Rail Review in January 19 suggested the devolution of infrastructure management to TfL as well as control of service specifications. I was wondering...
Well, so yes, so just to be clear, we've never received infrastructure management as part of the devolution we've had to date. So if I misled the committee, I apologise, Chair, through you. We have in the model to date, as you know, we don't control the infrastructure other than the core bit, as it turns out, of the East London line, actually, where we do own the asset and own the infrastructure there. But the rest of it is operated and maintained by Network Rail. You're quite right, we did make the submission to Williams in that regard. What they will come out with is you know, who knows what the reality will be. And of course, I do recognise there's some challenges in that regard, because how, for example, do you determine that there is appropriate access for other operators who might need to use the same line of route, particularly freight operators actually, which is often the case, often challenging, as we've seen most recently on the Gospel Oak to Barking service. But you know, so I think that's all in the mix. But you know, we will. I think there are certain parts of infrastructure that we would be quite keen to get hold of. I will just say, though, just to be clear, that the new chief executive of Network Rail really seems to me to be driving the kind of metro-style response to infrastructure failures that I have been pushing for years on London Underground, and that you need in a high-frequency type of railway. So going back to the example of the North London line, if you are running 10 trains an hour in a metro-style frequency of service, you can't have a response time that historically we might have had some years ago of an emergency response person coming from far away in the country to try and fix a failure 3 or 4 hours later. I mean, that's no good. It would be no good on the Central line. It's no good on the North London line. So you know, we have to kind of have that philosophy. But I really think that the leadership and the improved structure, the different regional structure that the Chief Executive Network Rail has put in place is really going to deliver some exciting changes here.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Sorry.
Just to wrap up, so given that that promise has been made to have a fares freeze if we were to have more metronisation, what would be your advice for a prospective candidate who thinks a fare freeze sounds nice, but how would it be financed?
Well, I think my advice would be that you know, I've made some assumptions in the business plan, and I look forward to a discussion with whoever's elected mayor in May, or in fact it won't be me, somebody else will look forward to a discussion with whoever's elected a mayor in May to, I'm sure, have a robust and interesting debate on that topic.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Are you picking up the next question about unreliability issue?
You know, I can.
Can you please?
Okay. Yeah. How will you improve the continued unreliability of London Underground?
Well, I think I alluded earlier on, Chair, through you, some of the particular challenges we've had most recently, which relate to the Jubilee line and the crack we found on some of the trains on the Jubilee line, which we've now resolved and got back into a full service there. And I also alluded to some of the teething problems we had in the commissioning of the digital signalling area around Edgware Road, Baker Street, Euston Square, High Street, Kensington area of the District Metropolitan Circle, Hammersmith City line. So I would say that on the second of those, the first one, we have got a pathway where we fix the Jubilee line trains. We're back to running a full service. On the other one, we've just taken a little bit of a step back and said, look, what other things do we need to do, both in terms of our operational response when issues do happen with an individual train? Because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about individual trains having a missed code from the signalling system. All of this is safe, but the problem with safe in this aspect is that means, in effect, a stop, a red signal. And how quickly can we respond to reset that system on the individual train from the control room and from the resources we have on the ground, from skilled resources on the ground, to ensure the services move more quickly. Now, we've seen much greater progress in the last few weeks on that regard. So, again, Andy Lord, the Tube Managing Director, Stuart Harvey, the Director of Capital Programmes, they were out at the lab, if you like, the technical lab with our supplier just last week, and had a very detailed run through of all the things that we could do in mitigation for some of the challenges that are still there. There's a further software drop that is due to go in on the 8th of February, which is this weekend, which will take away a huge number of the challenges we've had in that regard as well. Clearly, it's been a difficult time for passengers, particularly on the Metropolitan line, and I have a real sympathy for them, and we have to do better, both in response and ensuring their journeys are at the reliable level that they would expect. So those are the two key areas we've been looking at. We've also had a few challenges on a couple of the lines with going back to Assemblymember McCartney's point about driver shortages at particular moments in time. That again is in a much improved position in the last few weeks. So we're getting much better in terms of full resourcing of drivers across those lines where we've had particular problems, which is good. And we don't, just for the avoidance of doubt, rely on overtime at all from our drivers, because tube drivers actually don't work over time. It's in their contract that they won't, apart from if they're running late and they get paid obviously for finishing late, but they don't work overtime in the way that national train operators do, national train operating company drivers do. So on all of those aspects, we're continuing to make progress. We've got some work going on our fleet. Central Line in particular has had some unreliability problems historically, actually right from when that fleet was procured in the early 1990s, and we've got a major overhaul program now in place on the Central Line to improve reliability there as well. So there's a number of work streams both across asset, operational and technical areas that are putting us on a pathway, and I can assure you, and I know you will meet him in due course, that the new managing director of the Tube is on fire on this regard. He is absolutely going to slam this.
To what extent has loss of capital projects affected the situation we're in now and will be going forward? Because obviously if we're holding on to rolling stock for a longer time, the situation you described feels like it'd be much more prevalent.
Well, I think it's a very good point, and it's why collectively we need to continue to make the argument for, for Bakerloo Line trains, for example, as the next tranche of trains to be built. Central Line as well. I mean, there is the opportunity to use this new factory being built in Goole for a much more prolonged period of time going forward to replace all the trains on the Bakerloo and the Central Line. And by then we'll be in this situation of having to look at new trains for the Northern Line and the Jubilee Line. At that phase of time. So it's about this continual pipeline of projects to replace trains going forward that is really important. And let's not forget as well the huge benefits you get from new trains. It's not just that they're more reliable, very, very important as that is. It's not just that they're cheaper to maintain because the new technology is modern and up to date and you can do them more with digital systems to apply to the maintenance scheduling. It's also because, for example, on the Piccadilly line, these trains will be walk-through carriages. They will be air-cooled for the first time in the deep tube. And everyone knows who travels at the moment on these deep-level tube lines and the contrast with the new trains on the Circle and District line, what a fantastic improvement that will be. So, we have a common cause, and I know you share that common cause about how we can ensure the momentum continues.
Okay. What is driving poor train operator attendance?
Well, I think it's a number of factors. I mean, by the way, these are blips in particular parts of the network that are more prevalent than others. I mean, the way that train operators move between lines is a particular challenge. So a lot of drivers start off, actually, as it turns out, on the Piccadilly line, because that's a lot of them are allocated to the Piccadilly line when they first join, and then are trained up to drive on the Piccadilly line. They often then transfer to other lines that are more close to where their home is, and that makes sense from them from a personal perspective. You wouldn't want to not allow that to happen, encourage that to happen, but that can then create some cyclical vacancies on the Piccadilly line. But we've got much more smart now at ensuring we're ahead of the curve and have the next tranche being trained in advance of any movements on, so that you have a much tighter way to roster every driver depot and every shift on the train. So this is again, it's a continual effort, and it requires decent local management, and we're putting a lot of effort into local management as well to ensure they get the right support, both from our occupational health department, but from human resource colleagues as well, to ensure we continue to focus on this issue.
Okay. Why have passenger journey forecasts continued to prove optimistic on London Underground and the Overground and the DLR?
Well, I think, again, it's, I wish I had perfect vision forward about what the economy and what demand would be on the network. But as I said earlier on, and we will share the analysis, going back to the earlier comment, because I think it was asked for by the Deputy Chair, and I'm very happy to share that analysis in the fullness of time. We are in very strange times in terms of the fluctuations we're seeing in the tube. We haven't seen that for the last 20 years, as I say, apart from in 2008, because literally week by week, we can see some quite significant fluctuations year on year in terms of demand on the tube. I have absolutely gone for a pessimistic forecast for both this year that we're in and for the business plan years. I say pessimistic, pragmatically pessimistic, I think, given where current trends are.
Sense.
And we're broadly on those lines. We're not doing any worse than that, just for the avoidance of doubt. Tube demand is still growing by about 1.5% year on year, so it's still increasing. It's just not at the 5 or 6% levels that we saw a few short years ago. But, again, I don't know whether that is cyclical. I don't know whether there'll be a sort of post exiting the EU bounce. I've no idea. I'm not I don't think any economic forecast forecaster. And we do take intelligence from all the economic forecasters in the city and in the GLA and everywhere else. And they're not proving to be perfect in this regard, and we're not perfect either.
Have they been traditionally optimistic?
No, I think until the last couple of years we were pretty much on track, and we were pushed quite heavily by the Budget and Performance Committee to be a bit less bullish in the future business plan, and we heeded that advice, and the latest business plan will show that we have been more prudent in our assertions, and anyone who knows my CFO well will know that prudency is written all over him.
In view of the fact that you've just said these are uncertain times, they feel different.
Yeah.
Has anything changed in the model? Is there a new tactic? Is there a new algorithm? Is there some kind of analysis to try and adjust to the times we're in?
Well, again, it's very difficult. I'm not trying to be evasive with the question. It's very difficult because it does vary from time to time. So again, despite the fact that these challenging times, we still saw on Black Friday, just before Christmas, record numbers on that day on the tube. Way over 5 million journeys on a single day. And by the way, that compares to the busiest journey ever we saw in the year 2000 on the tube of 2.5 million journeys with exactly the same footprint of the tube. It shows what steady state investment gives you in terms of increasing the capacity of the network.
But it's just in reaction to your comment to say things are different. Like the difference between now and then is a larger population. I'm sure the analysis has that in it. But if we do the same thing as we've done traditionally, which you suggested cannot adjust to what we have going on now, we'll get an inaccurate outcome. Surely someone somewhere is trying to take into account the new paradigm.
Well, we are, but we are no more. We no more have the absolute answer to this than any other economic forecast over the river here or anyone else does.
We're not asking for an absolute answer, but a closer one would help.
Well, of course. So just to reassure you, of course we look at this on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis, and we try and adjust our intelligence based on the most recent experience. So of course we have to do that. And it goes back to my earlier comment about off-peak and weekend discretionary trips. What more can we collectively do, what we could do with London and Partners and others to encourage greater discretionary journeys into the city, because that's part of all of this.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Assemblymember Prince, you wanted to come in?
Thank you. Commissioner, are you satisfied with the number of Londoners who are suffering from excessive tube noise in their homes?
No, and I think it's a continual challenge, and it's a very complicated engineering challenge. So I mentioned the Director of Asset Performance in London Underground earlier on. He's now moved into a different role, but he has been, as you will know, gone to a lot of individual homes and assessed what can be done and what needs to be done to improve the noise levels in people's properties. It's a really important issue for me. Of course, it's been exacerbated for some people. I fully understand, by night tube services operating on Friday and Saturday night. I think, again, we've had some areas where there has been, because of intervention, some significant improvements. We've actually also had other areas where it hasn't improved, and I recognise that. Equally, we've got another challenge because of the way the engineering and the science works here, that sometimes improving the noise reducing the noise for people in their properties actually has increased it hugely for those travelling on the trains. And so we've got this kind of balancing effect on some lines to actually ensure that we continue to deliver both. We need to have a tube that is comfortable for people to travel on and from a noise perspective, but we also, of course, need to recognise from a good neighbour perspective what we have to do for our neighbours that work with us.
Getting into specifics, there appears to be some locations where there seems to be very little more that you can do without spending serious amounts of money. What's your answer there?
Well, if there are places that we can do that, we'll do it. I mean, I'm absolutely determined to do whatever we can in this regard, and you and other Assembly members have been, quite rightly very vocal on behalf of your constituencies on this matter, and I can assure you we will keep doing whatever we can to try and mitigate this. But it is not always simple and straightforward. There isn't one single answer that works everywhere. So, on the Jubilee line, we've had some challenges that have been mitigated to some extent with rail grinding. That isn't always the answer elsewhere, because it's quite about track form and how we install different types of rails and suppression issues. But that in itself can create additional challenges, as you well know, with the with the noise on the train itself. So we've got to take both of those issues on board. It's not an exact science. I wish it was. I wish it was straightforward. I think if it was, we probably would have solved it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can sort of agree with you in many respects that you certainly have tried.
Yeah.
And in some circumstances there is evidence that there has been a reduction in noise, and of course sometimes noise and vibration are linked. When you reduce the vibration, that increases noise.
Yeah.
But there are some locations where a bit more money being spent either on people's properties or by building a large wall would have a significant effect, but there seems to be a reluctance to do that.
Well, I think first of all, it's better to eliminate the cause of the noise at source. So, for example, I know in the two particular areas that you quite rightly have highlighted between Wanstead and Leytonstone, there have been, as you acknowledge, reductions in both those locations since the interventions we've given. There's been some very significant ones on the northern line between Assemblymember Dismore has continually raised with me Camden Town to Euston, and there's been significant reductions in those areas as well as to Kentish Town. But I'm fully aware that there are always other things we can look at. I don't rule out anything in terms of further mitigation either for properties or adjacent to properties, but it is, I think, really a better use of resource strategically for London to try and get to the technical solution on the track itself and on the noise itself, rather than necessarily just to try and kind of mitigate the effect of the noise. If we can get to the core, then that's got to be a better way to do it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Assemblymember McCartney.
I want to ask you about step-free access, if I can. Currently, there are 12 new step-free stations in progress.
Yeah.
Are you going to meet the deadline for them to be opened by this spring?
Well, we're certainly going to get them open this year, that's for sure. Now, in terms of the individual stations, there are some where there have been some challenges identified. I mean, this is part of the challenge of our Victorian infrastructure. I want to make sure that when we commission and open these lifts, they work and they're reliable from day one. So I'll give you one example, and I know the Chair will be particularly interested in this. When we started doing the work at Harrow and the Hill, we discovered, despite the survey work and everything that we've done, there were all sorts of wires and pipes and equipment, drainage equipment that actually needed to be replaced before we even got into the core lift installation. That was not foreseen in the original survey work, and it has inevitably therefore taken a bit more time to deliver in that regard. But I do emphasise that I want these lifts to open reliably. I think there have been times in the past where we've commissioned and opened lifts that haven't worked as well as they might have done, sometimes because someone felt there was, dare I say it, a bit like the Woolwich ferry, an advantage of some kind of unique design that should have been put in place. Let's get reliable, decent, standard lifts in our stations so that we can deliver much needed access. I have all the stations that are planned to be delivered have work going on site. Actually, bar one, there's Burnt Oak is slightly later in the sequence, but all the others have work going on site right now. So the trajectory to deliver, I can't give you a categoric assurance everything will be absolutely delivered by the spring, but I can tell you we're working flat out on this. I get an update on this every couple of days from the underground team to tell me where we are.
You talked before about standardising, the need to standardise, and the fact that it can save money dramatically. Do you think your successor will have plans to ensure that happens across all forms of transport you're responsible for?
Absolutely, and it's one of the advantages we've had of putting all the engineering into one team. Yeah. So one of the challenges we had before was that engineering was very balkanised in TfL. When I inherited this job, there was engineering functions all over the place, and they were all creating their own standard or applying their interpretation of an overall standard. Now, we're simplifying standards, making sure that they are straightforward, practical, fit for purpose, fit for use, fit for the reliability levels we need. Great example of that is a standard escalator that we're now procuring, not just actually for the core of TfL, it's the same escalators that are being installed across the whole of the Elizabeth line as well in the central section. So this is a standard escalator, whereas previously we had about 15 different varieties of escalators. So that's a massive issue, both in terms of reliability and in terms of cost, of course, because you're applying different standards to different pieces of kit.
And the other thing is that there were a further 6 step-free stations to be completed by spring 2022. But they've slipped back to 24 now, and the Mayor has said that's because of, again, certainty about the capital investment from government. So is that part of the negotiations you're having with government, or is that separate to the Access for All funding?
Well, I think, so first of all, Access for All, I mean, this is one of the strange anomalies, of course, as you know, that, so on the overground, we're allowed to bid for Access for All funding. We're not allowed to for tube stations. And while I think step-free should be an aspiration across the whole of the transport system across the country, actually, it does seem to me to be odd that some of these very intensively used tube stations don't even feature on an ability to apply for Access for All funding, because London is somehow exempted from the ability to bid into that pot. I've never, ever advocated for London to be treated more positively than anywhere else in the country, but being treated the same would be kind of quite nice in that regard. So it might be a slightly separate nuance in the ask for government, but it's an important one nonetheless. And, you know, I would just say that, just to give the context, that during the last 4 years, we've made 21 TfL stations step-free, which has been, you know, quite a lot of increased accessibility. And between 2012 and 16, which was the previous time, we delivered 4 step-free stations. So, you know, and it's really important, the strategically big stations that we've done, you know, Tottenham Court Road, Bond Street, Victoria, Finsbury Park, you know, those stations that really open up journey opportunities to so many more people. But I can absolutely assure you, I'm not taking my eye off the ball on the current tranche of stations where we've had some engineering challenges at individual places, but we're absolutely on top of it to make sure the work continues.
Good. And do you envisage that the current budget that you have for step-free stations actually will continue into forthcoming years?
Yeah, I mean, I want to, it's an absolute top priority. So, you know, I realise how important it is for, you know, to ensure our transport system is open and accessible to everyone. And I'm absolutely determined that we continue to have this right up at the top of our priority list.
Thank you.
Mike, in TfL website, it says that this financial year, Amersham, Burnt Oak, Cockfosters, Debden, Hanger Lane, Heron the Hill, Ickenham, Mill Hill East, Northolt, Austerley, Sudbury Hill, and Wembley Park stations will be step-free. Can you please check the status of that, whether that is accurate information on website, and come back to us?
I will make sure it's accurate, and I will absolutely give you.
And if there's any various, what they are.
Chair, I absolutely will through you do that. Absolutely. Yeah.
And with that, we'll need to reflect that on the tube map as well as they come on board as step-free.
Of course, and information provision is very important to me, particularly ensuring that real time as well, that when a lift for whatever reason isn't operational on a particular moment in time, that we're treated with absolutely the same rigour of information for our passengers as we would for a line delay or some other issue, because it is as materially important for people who rely on those step-free stations to get around.
One last very, very quick question on this subject. Will the current budget for the step-free access programme be maintained in subsequent TfL budgets?
Well, I very much
should it, in your view?
Well, it absolutely should do. I mean, there is nothing that is more important to me. I think the progress we've made has been significant in this regard. But, and by the way, the progress that we've made when, you know, as recently as 10 years ago, we were saying some of these stations couldn't get step-free access, and now because of new technology and new ways of doing things, we found a way of doing it. That just should give us renewed incentive, renewed motivation to continue with this programme. So absolutely.
Yeah. That extra focus does help.
Absolutely.
You know, the priority.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm mindful we have 2 important sections still remaining, and time as well, so if we can be a bit mindful of that. Caroline, on Assembly Member, surface transport.
Yes,
sorry,
indeed.
There we
yes,
go.
Thank
Finally
you,
got there.
Yes, so looking at surface transport, obviously we've got the 80% target for walking, cycling and public transport by 2041. Now, if you look at the numbers for mode share across the last 10 years, sort of private car use seems to be stuck stubbornly just hovering under 10 million trips per day. And so I'm wondering how you feel you're going to be able to kind of get that step change in terms of mode share in London, and what you think the challenges are on that.
Yeah, so we've of course risen from 50% walking, cycling, public transport in the year 2000 up to 63% now on our trajectory to get to 80%. But you're quite right, it is getting more challenging as we get nearer the top of this mountain. And I do think there's a number of factors that we have to a number of areas we have to continue to work on this. First of all is the increasing provision of cycleways, and we have done well in the last 4 years in terms of delivering more cycling facilities across London. That's really important. And by the way, again, going back to my earlier comment, none of this is only about central and inner London. This has got to be about the whole of London and all London boroughs in this regard. So that's one area. I think the other area is ensuring there is decent radial public transport connections in outer London to support the tube and rail network, and particularly therefore in that regard buses. And of course we've been trialling, as you will well know, for example, just one example, the demand responsive bus trials in both Sutton and Ealing most recently, with some interesting early results, not yet early enough to report back on how effective that's been overall, but we will of course come back to the committee in due course in that regard. So that's really important as well. And I think then it's also encouraging people to have the confidence in making those short trips, that there is proper real-time information of the public transport provision that is available to them, to prevent them having recourse to using a private vehicle, to ensure that they have a decent frequent bus service, to give them the choice they need to use a bus in outer London areas in particular, and that those outer London bus routes connect those centres of population, those places where people want to go for work, for leisure activity, to visit family and friends, and that's really important. So there's a huge number of things that we need to continue to apply our effort to get up to those figures. It's not an easy challenge, but it's one that we've got to deliver.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now, we mentioned briefly Vision Zero earlier.
Yeah.
Since the Vision Zero Action Plan was adopted 18 months ago, the numbers are not yet looking brilliant. We've got the latest Stats 19 figures are still the 2018 ones. We've not yet got the 2019 ones. But based on those and looking back to the 2005-2009 baseline, there's a good chunk of work that needs to be done to reduce the numbers of people who are being killed and seriously injured on our roads. And I don't doubt that you take this very seriously. You spoke very movingly about it earlier in the meeting. But what is TfL doing to really try and shift the dial in terms of the number of people who are being killed and seriously injured on our roads?
So I think one of the things that's worth just having in our mind in this regard is that over 70% of all collisions in London occur at a junction. And the Safest Junction programme, therefore, that we're embarked on, attempts to take an evidence-based approach to target those 73 junctions where high numbers of people have been killed or injured, and to create actually a more pleasant environment as well, and safer as well as more pleasant environment for people walking and cycling. We're on track to meet the target that was set of 41 safer junctions by May of this year, so that is on track right now. Already 31 of those junctions have been complete. Although Assemblymember Prince earlier on quite rightly identified that some need to go back and have rework done, it is worth saying that it's been an average reduction in collisions of 21% across all of those junctions that have been delivered so far. That's equivalent to 144 fewer collisions, 144 therefore potential deaths or serious injuries, which I think is really important. So we're and again, just to emphasise, going back to Assembly Member Prince's point, because it was a valid point. Of course, we'll continue to review all schemes after implementation, make further improvements if necessary, and we must continue to sort of prioritise the next phase of junctions beyond this. So the 144 fewer collisions, again, just to add a bit of richness to that number, that's 119 fewer cyclist collisions. 60% reduction in fatal collisions. So, really, really important work going on. Not the only answer, but a very important part of this.
It's important, but the scale, that's at the junctions that you have dealt with. There's an awful lot of junctions, particularly in outer London, that have not yet been tackled. So there is a sort of scaling up thing. I just wanted to pick up actually on something else that Assembly Member Prince raised earlier, which was about motorcyclist safety, because I understand that motorcycles both are at risk themselves, but also pose a risk, particularly to pedestrians. Yeah. And I just wonder what, you've obviously got issues like the gig economy. I wonder if TfL is doing anything to engage with gig economy employers to push road danger reduction amongst people riding mopeds and motorbikes, and also whether you've thought about using some of the mobile speed camera technology, sort of in particular, to pick up on issues around motorcycle safety.
Well, both are very valid points, and it is true, of course, the dynamic has changed quite a lot, and I think we must do more to work with the gig economy. We have done some work, and our Director of Innovation, Michael Hurwitz, has been in this regard quite proactive in all of this, working with Will Norman, of course, is a Walking and Cycling Commissioner as well. I think the other thing I would say on that aspect is that we have to be very careful we don't find ourselves falling into a non-regulated legalising of new technology such as e-scooters and other bits of technology around London. Some of these e-scooters can go up to 65 kilometres per hour with a tiny wheel set base, and this is Assemblymember Prince raised the issue of motorbike, but this is incredible, and you can see them yourself on dark evenings, which we're having in the winter, of course, as we do. The visibility of some of these things on footways or on cycleways or roadways or whatever. We've been having good discussion with the government, but London must always be open to new technology, which I do think we are, but equally we have to be very mindful of public safety and not just for pedestrians and other conventional cyclists, if we use that term, but also for e-scooter users themselves. And so we've been working quite heavily with retailers in this regard, but we must continue to do more of this. And again, working in cooperation with industry, much the same way as we did with the direct vision standard for freight vehicles, HGVs. We must work with industry, but also with the operators, as you outline in the gig economy. Yeah.
Then the culture within Transport for London, in terms of making decisions around junctions and with all the sort of big new design projects that are going on, do you think that there is enough of a balance or a rebalancing towards the safety of people walking, people cycling, as against the volume of traffic flow? And you've always got that tension of balancing keeping the roads moving with whether that is people in vehicles or whether it is people on foot and on bikes. Do you think you've got the balance right in terms of when those decisions, difficult decisions, are being made about mass flows of motorised vehicles as against the movement of people walking and cycling?
Well, I think we always need to hold ourselves, and indeed you and others need to hold us to account to make sure that we are getting those checks and balances correctly prioritised and those issues properly addressed. The one thing I would just say, actually, if I may, that one of the really encouraging things over the last 4 years has been working with someone like Will Norman as a Walking and Cycling Commissioner, who, I often joke with him and say, you're really the Walking, Cycling and Bus Commissioner, actually, because his perspective on ensuring there is proper and effective use of bus lanes while recognising the the very specific requirements to ensure that we keep pedestrians and cyclists safe as well is a real example of that in action, those kind of decisions in action. And also when I look at some of the work that we've been doing to improve the experience for pedestrians at busy junctions, so whether it's diagonal crossovers, to ensure that people can more effectively cross busy junctions without having two waiting times, if you like, and therefore the potential for people to make risky decisions in terms of crossing the roads. We've had one I was just looking at the other day and hearing the results of just to the south of Blackfriars Bridge, just up from our offices, where we've changed the configuration of the pedestrian flows there, which make it a much more seamless crossing from south to north than it used to be, where you were held very, uncomfortably actually, in a safe area, but in the middle of the road, waiting for the second pedestrian signal to activate. And that kind of standard that we're increasingly applying across our investment decisions, I think, is really important. So I don't think we're perfect yet. I don't want to give you that sense at all. But I do think I really detect a shift in our strategic thinking on this regard. And again, it is often because of the challenge and support we've had from this committee.
Thank you. Now, you mentioned buses in passing there, with reference to Will Norman. Yeah. I've recently seen a TfL paper from actually back last September, which said that using iBus 2 to get intelligent speed adaptation, ISA, on all buses by 2022 is actually not going to be possible. Now, this is, what it said is, in order to roll out ISA on as many buses as possible, as quickly as possible, we're seeking solutions directly with the bus manufacturers. We're also encouraging them to adapt the software on their existing models. But the retrofit programme is planned to begin in the next financial year and will run until 2024. Now, I think we were all under the impression that ISA would be rolled out fully by 2022. So my question is, why wasn't this communicated more clearly, and does this delay seriously affect the bus safety programme?
Well, I'm sorry it wasn't communicated more effectively, and I'll certainly follow up on that, so I apologise for that if that was the perception, because perception is reality in that regard, I've no doubt. I think there is a challenge with this technology and how quickly you can implement it, and that's only really possible to identify as you get into the serious implementation phase with the manufacturers. I'll be meeting one of the bus manufacturers again within the next couple of weeks at their base to ensure that they understand the importance of all of this. And of course, it is only one aspect of the bus safety programme, and I outlined earlier on some of the other aspects. I'm sure you've seen some of the technology we're introducing on buses more broadly, and I mentioned the Mobileye example that Abellio have been putting in place. I've mentioned our example now operating on the Route 100 of the bus with the greater CCTV instead of mirrors, and actually when you sit in the bus driver's position in that vehicle, it really does feel entirely different as to the sort of technology that is available to her or him as an operator of the vehicle. So there's a series of individual issues that make a material difference. The other thing I would say that both the manufacturers, but very importantly the bus operators, are absolutely in the same camp as this now. So when I meet the group chief executives of these companies that operate the bus service for us, as I said earlier, a few years ago, they felt like they were being it felt to me they were being dragged reluctantly into delivering something. Now they're really passionate about this. So Go Ahead London sponsored the last Bus Safety Summit, which we had the Wellcome Trust just before Christmas in November, the end of November last year. It was an entirely different tone from where we were just 2 or 3 years ago. So this is about a sense of momentum, and I really feel that momentum is with us now in this aspect, quite rightly.
I think that the important thing about ISA is if that keeps the buses from going over the speed limit, then it's a really good way of keeping all the flow of traffic flowing at the right speed for the right road.
It's very important, and I think I don't want to, for any sense, give the impression that that's not still very important. It's just a matter of the practicalities of phasing this in. I mean, to some extent, it's a bit like the electrification programme, which I have got huge. Keep putting huge pressure on the team to see how much faster we can do it, and then they remind me of how forward-cutting we are from a worldwide perspective in this regard, particularly with double-deck vehicles. So, we have to absolutely have a credible plan, but also have one that continues to keep the pressure on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So then, looking at TfL's capital programme, And we've seen kind of year on year a bit of an underspend, particularly on healthy streets spending. So do you think that TfL has the capacity to deliver enough that, you know, so that we can get those attractive, safe, popular, comfortable conditions for walking and cycling?
Well, I think again we need to keep our pressure up on this, and for the avoidance of doubt, the healthy streets funding, the changes we've seen in this business plan compared to the last business plan are almost all down to the decision we had to make on the Rotherhithe to Canary Wharf crossing. So just be clear on that. But I think we I alluded to this earlier on actually in the wider capital programme. The concept of over-programming is particularly important in the context of healthy streets because of what I said, I think, in the answer to the question from the Deputy Chair earlier on, because you know some of these schemes, best intentions, best planning that you could have in place, for whatever reason there is a legitimate local concern raised by some residents or businesses at a local level, and that means you don't spend the money as quickly as you might have wished to do so. The really important thing, and this is where we are much more sophisticated now, is having a series of other programmes that then just rise up the priority list so you can continue the momentum of delivery even if you get some unforeseen blockages on the way of some of the initial schemes. So I think that's a really important process going forward. It will therefore allow all the allocated funding to be spent and to ensure that we have real momentum in this regard.
Okay, well that's encouraging, that you've got a way of sorting out the pipeline, although I don't think there's any added investment for healthy streets in the 2020-21 budget. So do you see the healthy streets budget growing over time, or do you see it as a stationary thing?
Well, I'd like to see it growing, because clearly the reality is if we're going to continue to increase the number of people who are walking and cycling in London streets as part of, with public transport, the 63% increase, then we need to ensure we invest accordingly. And that does, without sounding like a crack record, rely, of course, on the certainty and pathway of capital funding going forward that I know we all seek to lobby the government on.
Yeah. Now I've got one tiny little query, which is I've been asking, I've had a question since the 18th of November about healthy streets funding by borough. Can I just put in a bid to get a reply to that, please?
Oh, I'm really sorry.
Don't worry, but I just thought I'd seize this opportunity to nudge you on that one. So then, moving swiftly on to the ultra-low emission zone, and obviously we're going to be picking up on that in a much bigger way in our next meeting next month. But I just wondered what feedback you'd had from businesses on the ultra-low emission zone.
Well, I think generally there's been nothing particularly negative. I think again this is an example of something that there was quite a lot of concern expressed in advance of its implementation, and I think the very fact that we have seen compliance at the levels it at of 77.7% compliance in my latest figures, which are the December figures just out, is a fantastic achievement. And of course, as you know, it doesn't just improve the quality of air in the zone itself, it improves the quality of air more broadly across London. The really important level of focus we've got to have now, and you alluded to this in terms of your next meeting, is of course how we properly work with boroughs, businesses, communities and everybody when we extend this to the North and South Circular Road, which we'll be doing. That's our next level of focus to ensure that's a successful delivery there. So good progress so far, much more to do for the next much more challenging phase.
Thank you. Chair, I'll hand back to you now for the last two bullets.
Thank you. Assemblymember Copley.
Thank you, Chair. Moving on the subject of buses, how are you managing the cost of bus operators' contracts in the context of reduced passenger demand for bus services?
Well, luckily, there is still a competitive market out there for bus operators. So the bus operators still bid for routes when they come up. There's a continual cycle, as you know, of bidding for routes. So they obviously consider it is still commercially viable for them, and clearly they are still bidding. So despite the demand changes that we've seen, which of course are, I should point out, significantly lower demand changes than we've seen in the rest of England, actually the bus operators continue to come to the market and continue to want to operate routes.
got some figures here actually that say that in London we saw bus use drop by 1.2% in the last year compared to a drop of just 0.1% outside of London. Where are your figures?
Well, so my figures are not necessarily based on an annual basis where there are some ups and down perturbations, but actually if you look at it across, so if I look at it actually even going back 20 years, there's been a 0.6% drop in demand in London bus ridership overall. That's very, very low actually compared to where you look at the other cities. So I'll share with you my statistics for the wider England. I mean, the other thing I would say is if you look at some English cities, I'm not necessarily going to name them because it wouldn't be fair, there's actually been a total elimination of some bus routes for certain times of the day, which of course means it's if somebody wants to go out in the evening, it's an impossible situation to get a bus back after they've been out in the evening because bus routes are finishing at 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening. That's not something
No, of course. No, we compared to the rest of the country, we are blessed here in London, but we still obviously want to have the best service we possibly can. And how much of that decrease do you put down? Because there's a sort of, in a sense, the good cause, which is more people switching to walking and cycling, but then there's the bad cause, which, you know, if buses are getting slower and people just aren't using them, do you know how can you sort of say how much is down to one and how much is down to the other?
It's very difficult to determine that. I mean, sorry, I should have said, by the way, the 0.6% reduction is in over a 10-year period, not a 20-year period. Sorry, just to be clear, I just found the place in my notes for it referred to that, so apologies. So it's very difficult to be categoric about that and how many people are walking and cycling for part of their journeys, although it is interesting to note that if you look at a rainy day, a wet day, actually the taps onto a bus do increase. So clearly those some people who might have otherwise have been walking do tend to use the bus. You know, it's natural human behaviour. I think the other thing that's a reality, again, I know this committee's had some discussion on this in the past, is clearly, you know, app technology, other technology that gives so much real-time information about when the next bus is coming, and we are all, as human beings, much less patient about waiting for anything now than we would have done. So whereas a few years ago you might have said, well, I'll happily wait for 5 minutes for a 10-minute bus journey, now you're much more likely to say, well, you know what, I'm going to walk. And of course, because the signage and the provision for walking for pedestrians and cyclists has been improved so dramatically, you may well make those alternative choices. So that's why I think it's important that we do look at the bus network, and as you know, we've been doing some of that to ensure that it is supporting those growth areas that are so important to London, to ensure that they are able to function and have access to public transport appropriately.
And are you expecting the drop in passenger demand to continue, especially with the efforts that are going into encouraging people to walk and cycle, and how are you going to offset the loss of passenger income?
Well, I'm not expecting it to continue to fall, because I am expecting there to be growth in outer London. And already we've seen, for example, where we put in new bus services to serve places like Kidbrooke, for example, we've seen new journeys being made by buses that wouldn't have been made before. Clearly that takes a time for that demand level to be built up. The types of trials we've been doing, as I alluded to earlier, with the demand responsive trials in Ealing and Sutton, that's the sort of potential that could grow the market, that you could then potentially look at providing a regularised, you know, a more conventional bus route, because you've stimulated some demand growth there. And of course, the other thing I would just say is that I don't see there being always a conflict between an increase in walking and cycling journeys with bus journeys, because what you do see, and there is some evidence to support this, that those who use public transport for their core journey to and from work are much more likely to walk and cycle while they're in the centre of London for some of their other residual journeys during the day. So whether it's in a cycle hire scheme that we provide, or other cycle hire schemes or whatever, or whether it is walking. So the two actually can be more aligned as an objective than I think is sometimes considered to be the case.
Okay, and in terms of the demand responsive trials, when are we going to have some sort of hard data on those, and whether they're successful? I
think it'll be another 2 or 3 months before I can give something categoric, but again, very happy to bring it back to this committee at that point.
Thank you. And considering that the greatest period of growth in bus patronage in recent times correlated with significant investment in bus services and networks, what are the long-term investment projections for buses in London?
Well, so I think, again, you know, we've got a situation where it's somewhere of the order of 800 million is the subsidy that we provide for buses in London at the moment. That's a lot of subsidy. It's very, very important that that continues. It's important in two regards. One is that the level of concessionary fares that we apply to bus passengers is unique in terms of what it is across the country and indeed across the world to some extent, but I absolutely think it's an imperative to ensure that those who most need support to travel on public transport in London get that level of subsidy, get that level of concessionary fare support. So that's very important. But it is important that we do bear down on such costs as we can. So that is working on the, as you alluded to in your first question, the commercial arrangements we have with contracting with bus operators. I've got a vision, and I've been talking to this with the bus team, about the bus operators becoming, I don't mean to be rude because it's the way the concessions have been operated before, but becoming less dumb, if you like, in their just operating the services. How can they work with us on revenue generative ideas, because they are in other aspects of what they deliver, very focused on revenue generation and very focused on opportunity. So how could they help us with that to ensure we can continue the types of subsidies that we need to have, but we get more of an income stream as a result of that. So I think we do have to just continue to review the model here, and I know that's something that Gareth Pyle and the bus team are looking at very carefully right now.
Okay, thank you. And moving on to safety.
Yeah.
How can you ensure that the robustness, rigour and transparency of bus safety investigation, how can you ensure the robustness, rigour and transparency of bus safety investigations when the operators responsible are investigating themselves?
Well, there's two things. First of all, a senior member of our bus team, that's TfL's bus team, goes to every single serious incident, whether it's a death or a serious injury, where the bus has been involved on our network in something we call Go Look See. It sounds like a bit of jargon, but it's really important because I'm sure we're all the same. Unless you go and look at something, you look at the context, you look at the junction, you look at the environment, you look at the circumstance in which a collision has occurred, it's very difficult to ascertain a perspective just looking at a map. It's much more difficult to do that. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is the level of dialogue that we now have with the bus operators is entirely different in this regard. So, the tragic fatality we had in South London recently of a bus driver from part of the Go Ahead family was Kenneth Matcham. Very tragic fatality, unusual fatality of a bus driver. Was a great example where Claire Mann and the bus team were working absolutely hand in hand with John Traynor, who's the responsible senior manager for the Go Ahead group. There was not a sheet of paper between us in trying to get to the issues around what caused this and what the challenge is. And I really do feel that there is no more a sense of sort of defensiveness on either part about whether the bus driver was at fault, or the bus was at fault, or the junction was at fault. There was just a genuine spirit of working together to try and get to the root cause as quickly as we can and to prevent reoccurrence. So the culture is quite different from where it was, I think, a few years ago.
Do you think there's an issue of public confidence, though, if the public are looking and seeing bus companies investigating themselves? Do you think there's an issue of confidence there, particularly when on the railways you have an independent investigation? And I'm wondering about public confidence and why that discrepancy between rail and bus.
Well, it's a good point, and I think the overall issue, this is something we've challenged quite a lot, is this difference between rail and bus, and it's one of the reasons actually that we hired Claire Mann, who's the director of bus operations now, who comes from a railway background, into running the bus service, was precisely to try and tackle some of those historic anomalies between the bus and the rail side. I think it's, I mean, one of the things that we haven't got the full results of yet, but I'm really, really proud of, is the leadership on safety that we've been embarking on in the last few years. You could say we should have done that 20 years ago, and you may well have a very valid point. But I do think that one of the tragedies of the rail network is that it has taken some very serious issues, the King's Cross fire, or the Westbourne Park incident, or Clapham Junction, or whatever it is, to reset the bar in safety accountability and safety management. Buses operate in a different way, and there hasn't been necessarily, thank goodness, that huge sort of shift, if you like, over time. So how can you ensure you get as much of that cultural shift without there having been this major incident? And I'm actually quite confident now that we have a pathway to deliver both that. I think your point about independent oversight of this is a valid one, and is something we should continue to look at.
Thank you. Considering recent findings on bus safety, do you have a plan to extend notification and investigation of major incidents processes to include data requests on minor incidents, not just major?
Yeah, I mean, we can always, as I said earlier on, we can always do better in terms of transparency of information. And I think we, you know, subject to whatever technical issues that my team will know more about than I do, we can try and be as open as we can with such data, of course.
Okay, thank you. And how do you plan to measure the impact of the bus safety standard?
Well, it will be at core how we improve in the overall target of Vision Zero, but how we improve safety performance on or issues by a bus. And, you know, I do think that when you know, I talked about the technology that is available now for buses. This is something that just a few short years ago, my team would have told me was impossible to do. And, you know, it's just when you force these issues by strength of leadership focus on this, of the type of scrutiny and support that committees such as these give us, and quite rightly the public give us in this regard, you can make progress, and we are, and we'll continue to do whatever it takes to make further progress.
Okay. And finally, we've had recently, of course, this very valuable research into driver fatigue, which has proved to be very, very useful.
Yeah.
Have you got plans to commission research which will look at fatigue in other transport modes?
Well, we have, and of course there's been some work already done and some new systems in place on the tram network, and I do think it's a valuable piece of research. We of course have already done some stuff in other parts of our estate, so I don't want to give the impression nothing has happened, but we can learn from this research, which of course is the first of its type in the world. But just to give you an example, just over the road at Bank Monument Station, where we're doing this major rebuilding of the station, just a couple of years ago, we were looking at the shift pattern of the people who were embarking on the project there. Now, this isn't a public-facing project at the moment, but it's nonetheless very important because zero harm, Vision Zero, applies to our own people as much as it applies to members of the public. And we discovered some strange things in terms of shift patterns. We were asking people to work, so they were quite long shifts. That in itself might have been fine had they lived around the corner. What you discovered was some of these people had long drives to and from work, sometimes a couple of hour drives, and then they were going home, they were trying to eat, they were trying to rest, they were trying to eat again and come back in for the following day's shift. Now that sounds really basic, but actually just tackling that has had a significant impact in the whole philosophy of safety management at that project, one that we've replicated across our other major capital projects and our maintenance activities. And it is around, I think, not just recognising that the wider issues about how people live their lives, not just when they're at work, but also actually, I think, engaging proper discussions between frontline supervisors and managers and individuals, because, you know, I wouldn't know and you wouldn't know about me whether there are issues in our lives that are preventing us sleeping as well as we might do in a conventional circumstance. So the whole trick of this, I think, is to have that proper human interaction between local managers and local people doing the jobs.
But what about other drivers and other more?
Yeah, so we are.
Are you going
So
to commission some research?
Yeah. So I've been talking to Andy Lord in the underground to see if there's some issues that we can look across that, and of course from our operators for the DLR and the overground as well, to see if there are some common lessons learned. It is a very specific piece of research around bus drivers, and there are some different circumstances prevailing with bus drivers, of course, but I'm very determined that we do learn the lessons more broadly.
Okay, thank you.
Assemblymember Prince.
Thank you. I've got a few questions on bus safety. Commissioner, you recently appointed a Chief Safety Officer from your own staff.
Yeah.
What industry recognised safety training does that person have?
So that person is part of her development plan in being appointed to that job, and she was the best candidate for that job, not just validated by me, I will say, but validated by independent TfL board members as well. She has been embarking on a series of formal training, working with the Office and Road and Rail Regulator, where we've engaged with her. She's been using some mentor support from the former chair of the Office Road and Regulator to ensure she gets all the technical qualifications necessary. This is primarily a leadership role, I would say. This is about ensuring that the bringing together of all the various safety functions across TfL for the first time in a position working directly for the Commissioner is properly created. So I'm very confident in her ability, her integrity and her intellect to do this job.
So What professional accreditation does she have?
Well, as I said, she's got a plan to embark on a full technical accreditation that she needs, but that was not seen as an absolute imperative in her getting the job. She has people in her team who are absolutely technically qualified. No more so, incidentally, do I have to be a qualified engineer to run massive engineering projects in TfL?
Well, I think there's a difference there, to be perfectly honest. But, but basically what you're saying, we now have a chief safety officer who has no industry recognised safety training or knowledge.
We have a very competent safety, health and environment director who's leading a very competent trained team with many skills and qualifications that they possess.
Thank you. Can we move on to who runs your bus page on your website? A while ago I wrote to you and I also wrote to the managing directors to get their details, because if someone has an accident involving a bus, as you know, all the buses carry recording equipment, but the process at the moment, as I understand it, is that people have to contact TfL and then TfL contact the bus operator. But of course that involves a loss of time, and quite often by the time the complaint gets to where it should be, that evidence, that video evidence, is lost. Would you not think it would be right and proper to publish the names and details of the managing directors, so that people, if they have an accident with a bus company, they can contact them directly?
Well, if there's evidence that the current process has prevented access to CCTV camera, then of course I'm always open for that further consideration. But I've never had that evidence presented to me in a way that determines that we haven't been able to get to the root cause of these issues.
You're saying you've never...
It's never been pointed out to me. So if there are examples as ever, seriously, if there are examples ever, of course I'll take those on board and we look at those in
we have that on record, so I'm sure we'll pursue that. Thank you. On the third point, you've only published 144 notifications and investigation of major incidents, NIMIs, I think they call them, in 2008. But actually, if we look at TfL's own data, we see that there's actually been 756 KSIs resulting from bus safety incidents. Why is there that big discrepancy between...
I don't know the answer to that, but I'll find out.
Yeah. Thank you. Also, you very eloquently at the very beginning of this, and also during your engagement with Assembly Member Copley, you talked about transparency and publishing data. But why is it that you failed to publish the bus safety data every quarter in a timely manner on TfL's website?
Well, there is sometimes a lag between getting the detail of the data and where we are with the reporting mechanisms that we are subject to adhering to, and that timeline. But again, I've always said, and it goes back to actually the comment earlier on about the cross-rail reporting and the PREP report or whatever, if we can do these things quickly, we absolutely will. I mean, there's nothing, we're not trying to hold anything back. We do publish everything eventually, so this clearly can't be an issue of us not wanting to be transparent. We'll continue to push on that regard.
And then when we actually comes to bus injuries, fatalities, we're going in the wrong direction, aren't we, Commissioner?
Well, actually, in terms of our scorecard targets, we're on track. I think there are...
Really?
There are certain people who are writing to certain people at the moment, I'm not going to go into names, who have got the wrong data that I don't recognise. So if that's what you're referring to, it's incorrect, and it's not data that we're familiar with.
Well, I've got a chart in front of me here that shows quarterly figures. Bus hospitalised with serious or unknown severity injuries by quarter with quarter trends. I believe that's one of your charts. And it very clearly shows a significant increase from quarter 4 2018 to quarter 3 2019, a very severe upward trend. So that's not one of your charts?
So reduction in people killed or seriously injured involving buses from 2005 to 2019. The period 5 actual figures are 71.9, 6 fewer people than in November 2018. The overall year-to-date target is 60%. That's 3 fewer people than year-to-date 2018, and we're in 64%. Those are the facts. That's in our scorecard. That's published for period 5 numbers year-to-date.
So you're comparing that to 2018?
Well, I'm comparing it to the measure that we have in our scorecard, which is the measure that...
But if we compare it to earlier years, Commissioner, you'll see that the figures have increased.
Sorry, this is from 2005.
I mean, we can always pick random figures, but
well, no, I can't.
You know, the general trend.
To be fair, I can't, because the scorecard is very clear. It's from the 2005 to 2009 baseline. That's the figures I'm measured against. That's the figures that were agreed by my board, and that's what I hold my team to account, and I'm held to account to deliver. And that's the figure that at the moment, year to date, is an improved trend. I'm not complacent about this for the avoidance of doubt. There's always more we can do. But the bus safety standard is a significant step forward, significant progress. The leadership changes I put in place in the bus team over the last few years are beginning to deliver results. I wish we were moving faster, as I wish we were moving faster on Vision Zero overall. But we have to continue to apply our energy and effort to ensure that we make inroads in this regard.
So you would agree, though, Commissioner, that's my last question. So you would agree, Commissioner, that with an average of just under 25,000 collisions per year, over 66,000 injuries and 10 deaths, that the safety of London bus system is unacceptable?
I would regard any death or serious injury with or on a London bus as one too many, in the same way that I regard any death or serious injury on any part of London's transport network as one too many, for the very reasons I outlined earlier on, is because these are individual human beings. And I will leave, in my remaining time here, no stone unturned to ensure we do whatever we can to improve this picture wherever it sits across transport in London.
Thank you.
Chair, Assemblymember McCartney.
I want to start by thanking you, actually, because I've questioned you many times about a bus route to North Middlesex Hospital through Grange Park and Winchmore Hill, and we finally just completed the consultation. And not only that, but actually a super long route that joins up both Chase Farm and North Mid. So I really hope that's going to be put in place, and that's really welcome. So
Call it the Mike Joanne route, I think, don't we?
Excellent.
We're going to have a bus named after you.
Yes.
But obviously, as a central London bus review showed, a knock-on effect of one bus route will have an effect on others. And so you did a central London bus review. Is it not the time for us now to have a outer London bus review, actually looking root and branch at this, particularly with the amount of developments and new estates that are coming online over the next few years in our city?
Yeah, look, I think I kind of alluded to that earlier on in terms of my, you know, if I were to be here for the next mayoral term, one of the things that I would want us to continue to make progress on is on how the mayor's transport strategy becomes a reality for Outer London. And I think that's not trying not to answer your question, but it is at the core of your question, actually, which is how do we ensure there are these proper radial connections between these new centres that either exist because of new housing developments or redevelopment, communities in and around Outer London. And I have to tell you that when I go and visit borough leaders and borough chief executives in Outer London, it is a common theme of debate. Not to say everything is wrong at the moment, but just to say we need to collectively be working more imaginatively in looking at what opportunities might exist for improved public transport provision in that regard. I don't think this is a borough by borough issue, though, and I do keep reminding them that, because of course London isn't constructed on the basis. I know you didn't say that, but some borough leaders occasionally get confused that it is a borough by borough. It's actually a cross borough issue about how you get decent connections, whichever borough you're in, to a rail hub or to a tube station or whatever it is. So I think we definitely need to do more of this. I think we need to, you know, I've asked for a continual monitoring of the increased ridership or the ridership growth that we've seen as we've applied new routes. I mentioned the Kidbrooke one earlier on just as one example. There are others, of course, and I'd be very happy to share details and send details to the committee on that regard. But we need to learn from those new developments and just remind ourselves always that London is not one single city. London is made up of individual towns, villages, quite large communities in their own right. That need decent connections, need decent bus routes fed into them, and also need to ensure that we take account not just of bus provision, but of walking and cycling in that regard as well.
I'm aware you're doing some small pockets of looking at bus reviews, but it doesn't seem extremely strategic to me, and it seems to be that, you know, TfL just needs a little bit bolder and actually really take somebody. It's going to be difficult.
I think so. And I think that, you know, as everyone will know, and you will know because your constituents will raise things with you, that any changes in bus provision of wherever it is in London does get a huge amount of attention paid to it. But, you know, if I look at last year, the 301, journey times improved by up to 30% between Bexleyhead and Abbey Wood. That's being used already by 5,000 passengers a day before the Elizabeth line opens. I've mentioned the Route 355, Kidbrooke to North Greenwich, 3,300 passengers a day. People who would not otherwise potentially have used buses and used bus provision. So I think the benefit of the tactical changes we've had does need to be wider replicated in a more strategic look at this, and we are, of course, giving consideration to that, while recognising also that the challenge of the subsidy levels that I talked about earlier on is a challenge, and recognising as well that there is always an element of controversy when you reform routes even within central London, even with the very successful bus hopper, and even with some of the valid arguments you can make about duplication, replication of significant lines of route.
Right. Last but not least, can we have taxi and private hire vehicles? Assemblymember Curtin.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Yeah, good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah, I just want to ask you about the taxi and private hire trade and your regulation of that part of the transport system. What will you encourage the new TfL Commissioner to prioritise with regard to the taxi and private hire trade?
So I think both, well, first of all, I would just say that the black cab trade in London has a significant part to play in London's economy and in helping move people around the city, as does the private hire trade in terms of the work it does and contributes to as well. I think we have seen some real changes in the last few years, particularly in terms of trying to ensure that black cabs are greener and that the modern zero-emission capable vehicles are rolled out. I'm delighted that we've seen an increasing uptake in the zero-emission capable vehicle, and in fact the additional additive effect of the Nissan Dynamo, which is now being commissioned as well, will, I'm sure, make a further contribution as well. Of course, the Taxi and Private Hire Action Plan was designed also to do important things like raise the profile of the knowledge, to explore options for accreditation, and we continue to look at this closely. We continue to try and promote people to take up roles as taxi drivers in our city, and also, of course, we've been trying to support the trade, both trades, by ensuring that we give whatever support we can for the fact that we need to have cleaner vehicles on our city streets.
Right, you mentioned the zero emission capable taxis,
Yeah.
and since January 2018 there hasn't been a choice for taxi drivers. They've been forced to purchase the TXE for 2 years, which was vastly more expensive than the TX4. Do you have any regrets about how that was rolled out and the effect that had on taxi drivers?
Well, I don't have any regrets from the process to try and clean up London's air quality, because I think we all accept that's the right thing to do. I think it's also true to say that the support that we put in place, so by 6th of January this year, we made 2,054 delicensing payments for the owners of older, more polluting taxis. You can still, by the way, apply to these payments of up to £8,000. And I also think there is a balance to be made in terms of the upfront cost of a new vehicle, which I do understand your point, but also the operational cost of running a zero-emission capable taxi. The operational cost is significantly lower. So over a period of time, this is a more economic as well as a cleaner, greener option for London.
But that does depend on the availability of charging points and the price of electricity from those charging points as well. And one of the sort of concerns that taxi drivers have is that there aren't enough charging points. Sometimes they're very, very expensive. And also, they might get to a dedicated charging point and someone else is in there. There doesn't seem to be much policing of who's using the charging points, and so it's no good having dedicated taxi charging points when other drivers park there and use them, and then the taxi drivers can't use them and they can't charge up their vehicles. So what are you doing to address those issues?
It's a very fair question. So 226 new rapid charging points across London, 73 of those are taxi dedicated. Obviously we continue to work with private landowners and the London boroughs to increase the numbers of these. Taxi dedicated rapid charging points are clearly signed. There's road markings saying taxi only. The Metropolitan Police Service and our own road traffic enforcement officers patrol red routes on a regular basis. So again, trying to enforce against contraventions, and indeed 232 penalty charge notices have been issued to date for non-compliance in electric vehicle bay. By the way, I'm also exploring mobile CCTV enforcement for electric vehicle bays as well as part of all of this future activity, because the taxi trade has raised this issue with me, as I'm sure you'll be aware. The other thing I would say, though, just in terms of the evidence, because we do know whether people are having to wait when they get to a rapid charging point. Very few rapid charging points are experience any queues at all for people to charge up. There are some specific examples that are challenges. Southwark Street is one example where there is a challenge, and we're doing some specific work around that and enforcement, and that includes working with the City of London on Baynard House, just over the river, to ensure that it becomes a recharging hub in the fullness of time, because I think that's also got to be part of the model going forward. So although there is some apocryphal stories about people having to wait to get their vehicle charged, actually the reality from the evidence, because we know how often these are being used, is some of them are being used actually very little of the time, and they are in quite strategically convenient places as well.
Okay. Now the other thing you mentioned was cleaning up the taxi fleet. Do you consider Euro 6 diesel vehicles to be clean?
I consider that if you retrofit to Euro 6 vehicles on buses, then that technology is shown to deliver an improved air quality standard, and we've done that. We'll have the whole of the bus fleet delivered to that standard by the year. There is a different scale of Euro 6 that's capable for taxis, which isn't the same and actually is more polluting for taxis in terms of retrofit. And what I don't want to do is, if I had an ability right now to buy a bus fleet from scratch, I wouldn't buy even Euro 6. I'd buy totally electric, subject to manufacturing capability. And the same goes for bringing in any new vehicles onto the fleet of taxis going forward.
How about private hire vehicles?
Yeah.
Because you still allow private hire vehicles and via vans, on-demand buses to use new vehicles to be Euro 6.
Well, so on-demand buses, just to be clear on that situation, the on-demand buses aren't, the trials that we've had in both Sutton and Ealing, they're not coming into central London. They're actually only trials, as we say, with the Mercedes Vito vehicles for on-demand buses, and they're not even coming into what would be the ultra-low emission zone extension. The challenge with private hire vehicles has been in the way that they operate, is them coming into London and often patrolling around.
Do you consider them to be clean?
Well, I think the point is they're no longer exempt from the congestion charge. They're no longer exempt from they're not exempt from the ultra low emission zone. So if they're not clean, they will be paying appropriately. But 77% of vehicles coming into the ultra low emission zone, as I said earlier on, are compliant vehicles. So the interventions of both carrot and stick have helped in this regard.
Well, are you going to, in the future, insist that private hire vehicles will be zero emission capable as well?
Well, they will in the fullness of time, because we've seen the government announcement today, and we've seen the reality of the ultra low emission zone extension.
What do you mean by the fullness of time?
Well, okay, so the ultra low emission zone, coming in next year, the extension will of course improve the situation still further. So there will be a real imperative for operators of public private hire vehicles to be cleaner and greener. And you know, when I talk to the private hire vehicle trade, by the way, they are absolutely determined to work with us in this regard.
There was I think, a plan to make the private hire vehicle fleet zero emission capable from 2023. Is that still your plan? I
believe it is, yes. I'll double check and confirm that with you. Right. I believe it is, yeah.
Okay, that would be the fullness of time there,
yeah.
I imagine. You did then mention the congestion charge in relation to private hire vehicles. What are your plans for the congestion charge exemption and taxis?
I have no plans.
Okay, fine. And what are your prospects for progress on the regulation of pedicabs in London?
Well, it's a very good point. In fact, we were just talking about this the other day. This has been an ongoing challenge to get legislative time to achieve that. Actually, when I was talking about e-scooters earlier on, we have now just given some consideration of whether there might be an opportunity, and if there's going to be some legislative conditions applied to that type of new technology, whether we re-explore with the government the whole issue of pedicabs, where we all want to sort it out, but it's always been a problem to get any legislative opportunity so to do. So, you know, I do hope we'll make some progress.
Well, there really needs to be a whole new legislation, an act that covers taxis, private hire.
There absolutely does, and in fact we've been waiting for some time for this, and of course the challenges of the some wider issues that the government have been facing, I think, have prevented that getting the airtime it needs. But I'm optimistic now that we will get the opportunity to bring that forward, or for the government to bring that forward in legislative.
It does seem that there's a there's a government with a majority now, so things are perhaps more able to move forward in Parliament. But since the election, have you had any discussions with any parliamentarians?
Well, I've met, as I said, I've met with transport ministers, and this is part of the dialogue that we'll continue to have. But you know, we absolutely continue to push it. And as I said, we were just talking internally the other day about what mechanism we may seek to support them with from a pedicab perspective, particularly.
Okay, thank you. Now, one of the other things that has been an issue over the last 4 years or so is Uber. And why have TfL's disputes with Uber been so hard to resolve?
Have been, sorry?
Hard to resolve.
Well, I think you need to ask private hire operators that question rather than me. I mean, we have a very clear regulatory responsibility. You know, it is absolutely incumbent on private hire operators, whoever they are, to comply with the regulatory standards that we expect of them. And I will be unapologetic for putting passenger safety at the core of everything with regard to the regulatory decisions made. And that is a decision reserved to TfL. It's not a political decision. The Mayor doesn't make such a decision. It is entirely made by the regulatory team within my organisation, quite rightly so. And we will continue to be ensuring the highest standards of operational apply.
No, I absolutely agree with you on that decision. But there are alternative operators, and perhaps new big operators coming into the private hire market in London very soon. How are you ensuring, and how will you continue to ensure that alternative large private hire operators will be safe to use?
Well, we will apply exactly the same rigour with them, whoever they are, as we apply to existing operators. Okay,
thanks. Now, one of the ideas that's been floated is developing a charter mark, which would be some kind of voluntary accreditation scheme for private hire operators. And what are your thoughts on that?
I think there may be some merit in that. I think it's not necessarily a bad thing to do. I think what I'd like to do is get through this current regulatory cycle, if you like, and then review that in the fullness of time going forward. Whatever the courts decide will be a matter for the courts, of course, since it now is in legal process. But I do think that we need to recognise the different paradigm we now have with new entrants, as you allude to, and with the way technology has developed in the last few years.
Now, staying with private hire vehicles, the number of private hire vehicles on London's roads or being licensed has increased by 19,000 over the last 4 years, from 78,000 to 97,000 vehicles. There's a clear need to try to reduce that number, because obviously it causes congestion, among other things. What recommendations will you make to the new Commissioner regarding efforts to reduce the number of private hire vehicles on the road?
Well, it's not, of course, something that we have free rein to do anything about at the moment. It's not in the legislation. It's not something we have control over. I think this goes back to the legislative framework overall that I was talking about a few minutes ago, that we need to really get some certainty on issues, for example, like cross-border hiring, because again, there is the reality that London, there isn't, when I last checked, a a border of any sort between London and immediately outside London, and therefore the number of, even if we were to have control about the number of vehicles we could license, private hire vehicles we could license in London, of course it's not going to stop operators from outside London coming in. So this needs to be looked at in the round, and that but I do think that this is the recalibration of this market is something we need to be very aware of, and given our quest for an increased modal share for walking, cycling and public transport, clearly it is of concern. Equally, of course, I do recognise that unless and until we make further inroads into transport provision in Outer London, decent public transport provision in all parts of Outer London, some of which are brilliantly served already, and we're making progress, but then there will always be a demand for some of these private hire services to operate. So, I have nothing against the private hire vehicle sector at all, quite the reverse. They play an important role to play as well in parts of London where black cabs perhaps don't penetrate as much, but we do have to make sure we look at this in the round from a legislative control perspective, levers of which we don't have at our disposal right now.
Right, okay, thank you. The final thing I want to ask you about is something I have asked you about before, which is the knowledge of London, which is vital for training new taxi drivers. The number of taxi drivers is down, the number of taxi vehicles in the fleet is down by 2,500 since 2016. So there's an urgent need to promote the knowledge and support new entrants to the taxi trade. So what are you going to do to promote the knowledge of London and make progress on getting accreditation for it?
Yeah, so, well, you're quite right, and we do need to promote the knowledge of London. This is still a great career for people to embark on. So a key recommendation of the Taxi and Private Hire Action Plan, as I've said, was to raise the profile of the knowledge. So we published a brochure, as you probably know, How to Become a London Taxi Driver. This includes specific case studies of students from different backgrounds who've successfully gone through the knowledge of London process. It's available on our website. And I think we want to continue to support the dedicated, disciplined people who do operate taxis in our cities, and make sure that we continue to support them in what they are, after all, already proving to be, which is the best of their type anywhere in the world. So we'll continue to make inroads. I continue to meet personally with the representatives of the taxi trade, and I will continue to get feedback and input from them in this regard as well.
With respect, Commissioner, I mean, making a brochure is fine, but number of people who are doing the knowledge, the number of people going into the trade has fallen off a cliff and it isn't recovering. So I think you need to do more than just make a brochure. I think you need to actually get going on accrediting the knowledge, so that people who study the knowledge will have access to finance and schemes that will support them. So can you say something more, because this is quite urgent?
So we are actively looking at options for accreditation. We'll continue to look at this closely. Of course, we have to ensure that the standard is preserved, because none of us wants to dilute the standard of the knowledge going forward. It is something that makes it as unique as it is, but within that context, we are actively exploring those options for accreditation. So we'll continue to do what we can. I mean, we don't have direct control of all the levers here, and of course, when you've got a pretty much full employment economy, this is a challenging time for trying to get more people to be taxi drivers, the same way as it is to get more bus drivers or get more tube drivers or anything else. But we'll continue to do whatever we can. I'm always grateful for your input and thoughts on this matter.
Okay, thank you.
Got a couple of questions, Mike. One from Sean.
Mine's a very... How many registered black cabs do we have in London?
So number of registered black cabs is currently 19,113 as of the 26th of January.
How many charging points do we have?
So we have of the rapid charging points, I think I said we had, I just gave a number a few minutes ago. We have 226 new rapid charging points across London. 73 of those are taxi dedicated.
So 73 for taxis.
Yeah.
And we expect black cab drivers to buy this cab when there's only 73 charging points.
Well, because of the evidence I gave earlier on, which is that we know when these charging points are being used, and already there is more than sufficient for the number of zero emission capable taxis in place. As I've said, we'll continue to push our partners, boroughs and private landowners to add more of these rapid charging points. I am at the limit of how many I can do because of the amount of the road network that is our road network.
Sorry to interrupt you. The point is you're talking about what's happening now, and what you're asking is people to buy these very expensive cabs. If they bought these cabs, they would not be able to use them because there's simply many more cabs than there is charging points. Like they're not even related. 73 versus 19,000.
But can I just put this in context for a second? So I was talking with the very first owner-operator of the new Nissan Dynamo taxi, as an example. As soon as he'd been operating this for several weeks, and I asked him about that. I asked him that very point, as you would expect, and he said to me, he lives in outer London, so he travels into London and then works all day as a normal black cab driver going across the city, all lines of route. He said he had never once in those early weeks had to charge his cab at all in central London because the charging capability of these new vehicles in terms of the mileage range is so significant. So actually I think we do need to put this in context, and I'm not disputing your point about we have to make sure there is sufficient infrastructure for the number of vehicles. Absolutely. By the way, the answer is...
My point is we're not even in the same universe here. And I just say that because, of course, that will affect take-up. Because I live in Romford, where many a cab driver lives. And what they will suggest is they won't buy the cab because they can't charge it. Or if they have bought the cab, they drive in on the electric and then drive around on the engine because there's nowhere to charge.
But it's simply the facts don't back that up. So the facts do not back that up because the utilisation of the rapid charging points does not show there is insufficient supply.
Hold on. That may be if you're a cab driver. What happens is you'll go and queue once, and then you'll never come back. No. Because you can drive around and continue to make money with your petrol, and you won't take the risk on electric.
No, but it doesn't back up. So if I look at the statistics across the piece, it doesn't back up. And also, I would just say, and you know, I know you know this, I know your knowledge of this is extensive, but I would just say that battery technology is really quite developed and quite sophisticated now from where it would be. It's why, for example, in buses, we've been able to deliver an electric double-deck bus. When I started this job 4.5 years ago, people told me, not in my lifetime would there be the capability for a fully electric double-deck bus, because it never would be capable of operating its line of route. Battery technology is moving on a pace all the time, and LEVC and Nissan Dynamo are continuing to explore what modifications they make to battery provision to ensure how these vehicles can be operated.
I like you, welcome the vehicle, like the fact that it runs with battery technology, but let's be clear, battery technology is not what a black cab driver is faced with today. He or she will be faced with a cab that they can purchase today and the charging opportunities for that cab, and whatever happens in the future would be nice, but it's not what will drive your decision today.
So we have an app available to drivers, so if they park up for the break, they can see exactly where the rapid charging points are free, they know they can access them. Facts are there, the evidence is there on the utilisation of these charging points right now, today, and going into the future.
But I would just say you might have to ask why the charging points are not being used, and on top of that, where's the tipping point? Where's the point where you...
Assembly member, can you put that any questions you have with commissioners separately, please? Thank you. Very brief last question.
Yes, very briefly. I just want to touch on advertising on TfL. There seems to be a massive rise of advertisements, posters and billboards that feature the Mayor of London, Commissioner.
Yes, there's election in there, one can see.
And also, I've had complaints over the weekend that now he's taken to making announcements on TfL as well, Commissioner. Do you think this is appropriate in the run-up to an election?
I think what's appropriate is I take advice from my General Counsel on any issues appertaining to pre-election or run-up to pre-election periods, and I will assure you that we will assiduously follow that legal advice in every regard.
Thank you very much. On that note, Commissioner, thank you for the marathon session. Been over 3 hours, indeed. May I thank you finally on behalf of this committee and London Assembly for your contribution and commitment to London's transport and infrastructure. In your engagement with this committee, I certainly have found you not only patient, even at the times when you're provoked, but also pleasant and honest and fair. So thank you very much helping us to hold TFL to account, Mayor to account, as well as with our work, which has been considerable. And last point, may I also wish you, on behalf of round the table here in London Assembly, all the success with your next project, which is the World Heritage Site restoration of the Houses of Parliament. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to you all, Chair, and if I may just thank all the committee over the years, the successive members of this committee, for all their questioning and support, and quite appropriately holding me and the rest of TFL to account. And I wish all of you every success in whatever happens in the next few months and years to all of you as well. Thank you very much.
All the very best. Thank you very much. Right, colleagues, we still have another item. Before we formally conclude another session, can we agree that myself, Chair, in consultation with Deputy Chair and Group Leads, is delegated to agree a letter to government on infrastructure upgrades ahead of spending review?
Yes.
Can we agree? Thank you. So can we note the report in our discussion?
Noted.
Right. Next item is revised memorandum of understanding between London Assembly and Transport for London.
No,
Sorry. Yes. Revised, yeah. Okay. Can we approve the revised version of the memorandum of understanding with London Travel Watch attached in Appendix 1 of the report?
Agreed.
Great. Can we endorse the appointment of Anthony Smith as Joint Chief Executive and Accounting Officer, and note that the new Director of London Travel Watch, Emma Gibson, will act as the principal contact and liaison point between the two organizations on a day-to-day basis?
Agreed.
Great, thank you very much. Item number 7, our work program. Can we note the work program?
Noted.
Wonderful. Getting there. Commissioner, we've done the commissioner, he's gone. Thank you very much. Date of the next meeting, which is scheduled for Thursday, 12th of March at 10 a.m. in the chamber. Noted. Any other business? I have no any other business. Thank you, members. The meeting is now concluded.
GLA Chamber Sound.